The slap of the thick manila envelope hitting the reclaimed wood dining table echoed through our New Hampshire lakeside cabin like a gunshot. But the sound that truly cut through the quiet winter morning was my husband laughing right in my face. I sat across from him, holding a ceramic mug of dark roast coffee, letting the steam rise between us to mask the immediate shift in my eyes. The winter storm outside whipped against the frost-covered windows, mirroring the sudden chill taking over the room. Preston stood tall, adjusting the cuffs of a bespoke suit that cost more than his monthly salary as a regional director for a healthcare logistics firm. He looked down at my faded red flannel shirt and let out another sharp, mocking chuckle. He told me it was over. He announced without a shred of hesitation that he was leaving me for Kinsley, a 26-year-old subordinate from his regional office. He leaned over the table and demanded I vacate the cabin by Monday morning. He bragged that he had already outsmarted me, having transferred the deed of the property into his new personal trust to secure a bridge loan for his fresh start. He expected me to shatter into a million pieces. He wanted to see me drop to my knees and beg him to stay. He assumed my silence was shock, born from the reality of losing my supposedly successful husband. What Preston did not know was that I am not the low-level IT help desk worker he always complained about. I am a cybersecurity architect, and I recently sold a zero-day threat protection patent for $80 million. More importantly, he did not realize that I purchased this cabin 6 years ago entirely in cash through a blind corporate holding company that I exclusively control. By forging a transfer deed on a corporate asset to secure a bank loan, he had just committed textbook federal wire fraud. My name is Joy Walsh. I am 34 years old, and before I tell you how I systematically dismantled my cheating husband and his entitled family, I want to welcome you to the Samantha Told Stories channel. If you have ever been underestimated by someone who mistook your patience for weakness, hit the like button and subscribe. Drop your age in the comments below and tell me if you have ever sat quietly while an arrogant person dug their own grave. The biting wind from the White Mountains rattled the glass panes of the living room windows. Inside, the chill felt far more severe. Preston paced across the woven area rug, stopping to admire his own reflection in the hallway mirror. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, projecting the smug confidence of a man who believed he had just pulled off the perfect crime. "Kinsley understands what it means to be driven, Joy," he said, turning his attention back to me. "She carries herself with real class. She does not spend her weekends chopping firewood or sitting in the dark staring at computer screens. A man in my position needs a partner who elevates his social standing. You have been holding me back for years." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. The bitter liquid washed over my tongue, keeping my senses razor sharp. I did not raise my voice or throw my ceramic mug at his head. I simply watched him perform. "I need you packed and gone by Monday," Preston instructed, his tone shifting from mockery to a sterile business directive. "The contractors are coming on Tuesday to remodel the master bath. Kinsley prefers marble over this rusted cabin aesthetic." He tapped his knuckles against the stack of divorce papers. "Do not bother hiring some cheap strip mall lawyer to fight me on the house, Joy. I took care of the legalities last week. I filed a quitclaim deed transferring the property into the Preston Walsh Revocable Trust. The bank already appraised the equity and approved my line of credit. If you try to drag this out in court, I will bury you in legal fees until you cannot even afford a studio apartment." My analytical mind processed the raw data he just handed me. For Preston to transfer the title of this property into his personal trust, he had to forge a phantom deed. He assumed my name was on the public registry. He never bothered to run a legitimate title search because his towering ego convinced him he was the smartest person in the room. He bypassed a notary, falsified a signature on a fake document, and handed it to a lending institution to leverage a property owned by an unassociated corporate LLC. I felt a cold thrill ripple down my spine. I deal with digital threats and network intrusions for a living. I build traps for hackers trying to breach secure systems. My husband had just walked blindly into a legal snare so tight he would never escape. Understood, I replied, my voice smooth and devoid of any tremor. I placed my coffee mug on a cork coaster and stood up, leaving the divorce papers untouched on the table. I walked down the short hallway into the master bedroom. I pulled a canvas duffel bag from the top shelf of the closet and packed 3 days' worth of essentials with strict efficiency. Sweaters, socks, a heavy winter coat, and my encrypted work laptop went into the bag. The crisp sound of the zipper closing felt like the final period at the end of a long, tedious sentence. When I walked back into the living room, Preston was standing near the fireplace. His triumphant posture faltered, displaying a brief flash of genuine confusion. He craved the drama. He fed on superiority. My sterile lack of emotion was starving his ego. "That is it?" he asked, his brow furrowing. "You are just going to walk out? No tears, no begging? I guess you really are as empty as you look." I did not offer him a parting word. I slung the heavy strap of the duffel bag over my shoulder and pulled open the solid front door. The frigid New Hampshire air rushed into the warm cabin, biting sharply at my exposed cheeks. I stepped out onto the frost-covered porch and pulled the door shut behind me, listening to the deadbolt click into place. The snow crunched beneath my boots as I walked toward my SUV parked in the gravel driveway. The frozen lake stretched out in front of me, a vast sheet of white reflecting the pale morning sun. It was serene and quiet, a stark contrast to the betrayal I just left behind. As I reached for the door handle, a sharp chime emanated from my coat pocket. I retrieved my phone, the screen illuminated, displaying an urgent alert from my primary banking application. A new message stared back at me. An unauthorized wire transfer of $200,000 had just processed, draining our joint savings account. The balance now sat at a stark 0. I locked the screen. My breath formed small white clouds in the freezing air. Preston had fired the opening shot. He wanted to leave me penniless and homeless. I climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. The financial war had officially begun, and I was going to ensure he lost everything. The drive down the icy interstate toward Portsmouth took just under an hour. The historic seaport town felt isolated under the heavy gray winter sky, giving me the perfect cover to vanish. I bypassed the busy chain hotels near the highway and navigated toward a quiet boutique inn overlooking the Piscataqua River. I paid for a secluded corner suite in crisp $100 bills, ensuring my presence generated 0 immediate paper trails. The room smelled of fresh linen and expensive cedar paneling. I locked the heavy mahogany door, threw the deadbolt, and tossed my canvas duffel bag onto the foot of the king-sized bed. I did not collapse onto the plush mattress to cry. I did not spend a single second mourning the death of my marriage. I pulled my sleek titanium laptop from its padded compartment and carried it over to the glass desk positioned near the frosty window. I plugged in a secondary encrypted drive, hardwired my connection to avoid vulnerable public networks, and booted up my workstation. The screen flared to life, casting a pale blue glow across my face. I stripped away the pathetic persona of the quiet IT help desk worker and let the digital architect take full control. For years, Preston ridiculed my late hours. He would stand in the doorway of our spare bedroom, swirling a glass of cheap bourbon, rolling his eyes at the glowing dual monitors. He constantly complained to his country club friends that I was addicted to mindless online gaming. He whined that I wasted my youth staring at pixels instead of focusing on being a proper corporate wife who hosted elegant dinner parties. He never bothered to walk up and look closely at my screens. If he had, he would have seen dense, shifting strings of proprietary code. I spent those long, solitary nights engineering a zero-day threat protection algorithm explicitly designed to shield major financial institutions from catastrophic cyber attacks. Just 6 months ago, a global tech conglomerate purchased that exact patent. The buyout wired $80 million directly into a heavily fortified blind trust I managed. I could have retired us both on the spot. I could have handed him the wealthy country club lifestyle he desperately craved. But my generosity and my love for him died 3 years ago sitting on a sterile plastic chair inside a local hospital. My mother needed a specialized cardiac surgery that her cut-rate insurance refused to cover. I asked Preston to liquidate a small portion of his individual investment portfolio to help save her life. He refused, without a flinch. He stared at me with dead, empty eyes and claimed we were broke. He said we needed to protect our own future and could not afford to throw money away on a hopeless medical case. My mother passed away a month later. The day I buried her, I buried my marriage. From that precise moment forward, I became a ghost in his house, observing his narcissism, documenting his lies, and waiting patiently for the inevitable betrayal. Now that betrayal sat right in front of me, in the form of a drained joint savings account. I opened a command terminal window on my laptop and began typing. My fingers flew across the keyboard with practiced, lethal precision. Preston was a healthcare logistics director, not a network engineer. He still used our home Wi-Fi router with the default factory password printed on the plastic casing. Breaching his digital footprint took less than 30 seconds. I accessed his personal cloud storage and pulled the banking logs. I needed to see exactly where my $200,000 went. The data populated instantly in neat rows of financial records. Preston had executed an outbound wire transfer, but he did not send the cash directly to a standard checking account. The routing sequence showed the funds funneling straight into a corporate holding account registered to his employer. My heart rate slowed to a calm, steady rhythm. He had intertwined our personal funds with his regional healthcare firm. By routing stolen domestic cash through regulated corporate channels, he crossed a very distinct, severe legal boundary. He was mingling embezzled personal assets with heavily audited corporate ledgers, explicitly violating federal finance laws. I dug deeper, pulling the digital thread to uncover the final destination. The money did not stay in the healthcare firm. He immediately generated fraudulent vendor invoices, masking the transfer as a logistical medical supply payment. The fake vendor redirected the capital to an offshore financial institution located in the Cayman Islands. Preston told me he needed the cabin equity to buy Kinsley a luxury condo. He wanted me to believe this was simply a romantic getaway fund for his new life with a younger woman. But the data painted a far more desperate picture. I bypassed the offshore security proxy and traced the recipient wallet. The destination was not a real estate escrow firm. It was an international digital syndicate notorious for facilitating illegal sports betting and high-stakes poker. Preston was bleeding out. He did not just steal our savings to impress a subordinate. He was drowning in a staggering secret offshore gambling debt. The realization settled over me like frost forming on a window pane. He was not a calculated mastermind executing a flawless divorce. He was a panicked addict, scrambling to cover up severe financial crimes before his bookies or his corporate auditors caught up with him. Kinsley was just a convenient prop, a shiny distraction to make him feel powerful while his actual life crumbled into dust. My cell phone buzzed against the glass desk, shattering the quiet hum of the hotel suite. The screen displayed a new text message from Preston. I picked up the device and tapped it open. The arrogance radiating from his words was suffocating. He wrote that he had just called the bank to cancel all my debit cards. He told me I needed to learn a hard lesson about how the real world operates without him subsidizing my existence. He suggested I find a cheap roadside motel and start looking for a second job, because he intended to take every dime I ever earned during the divorce settlement. I stared at the message, and a cold, razor-sharp smile curled the corners of my mouth. He believed he was starving out a fragile, dependent wife. He thought cutting off my access to a few $1,000s would force me into total submission. He was entirely blind to the reality of his situation. He had just handed a cybersecurity expert the exact digital breadcrumbs required his federal indictment. I did not need his canceled debit cards. I had an $80 million fortress waiting in the shadows, providing me with unlimited resources to fund his destruction. I took a screenshot of his threatening text message and filed it into an encrypted folder labeled Evidence. Every threat he sent, every fraudulent routing number he typed, every lie he documented, provided me with another steel bar for his prison cell. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, letting the pale glow of the monitors wash over my face. I owned his property. I possessed his digital footprint. I held the irrefutable proof of his wire fraud and corporate embezzlement. I reached for my coffee, preparing to draft a formal summary for the Federal Criminal Investigation Division. I wanted the timeline flawless before I unleashed the authorities. But before my fingers could touch the keyboard, a harsh red light began pulsing on my secondary monitor. A proximity alert from the Lakeside Cabin security system triggered an immediate override. I opened the live video feed. The high-definition cameras mounted above the front porch captured a pristine silver luxury sedan pulling into the snowy driveway. The doors opened, and two figures stepped out into the freezing wind. It was not Preston returning to gloat. It was his parents. My toxic in-laws had arrived, holding empty cardboard boxes, ready to claim their prize. The pulsing red proximity alert on my secondary monitor bathed the hotel suite in a rhythmic crimson glow. I tapped a sequence of keys, switching the display from the offshore banking ledgers to the live, high-definition security feeds hidden throughout the lakeside cabin. The wide-angle lens in the living room captured the heavy front door swinging inward. A gust of biting winter wind disturbed the entryway rug before a pair of polished designer boots stepped over the threshold. It was Diane, my former mother-in-law, draped in a heavy mink coat that looked absurdly out of place against the rustic timber aesthetic of my home. Close behind her followed Edward, her husband, clutching a stack of flattened cardboard boxes. Diane brushed a snowflake from her immaculate blonde hair and let out a dramatic sigh of relief as she entered the warm living room. For 6 years, she had treated me like a temporary stain on her pristine vision of New Hampshire high society. She was a woman who measured human worth by country club memberships and the designer labels stitched into the collars of winter coats. I watched her perfectly manicured hands trace the edge of my reclaimed oak dining table. Her nose wrinkled in perpetual disgust. She despised my lack of pretense, and she never missed an opportunity to remind me that I did not belong in their elevated tax bracket. Edward dropped the cardboard boxes onto the floor with a loud, careless thud. The hidden microphone captured the sound with crisp clarity, piping their conversation directly into my headset. Diane immediately began issuing orders. She pointed a sharp finger toward the built-in bookshelves where I kept my collection of vintage novels and technical manuals. "We need to clear all of this junk out before Kinsley arrives," she instructed, her tone dripping with toxic satisfaction. "Preston is finally shedding that worthless, unmotivated anchor. I cannot bear the thought of his new partner walking into this house and seeing remnants of a pathetic IT worker cluttering up the space." Edward unfolded a box and grabbed a thick, black trash bag from his pocket. "I agree, Diane," he muttered, tossing my hardbound books into the plastic sack without a second thought. "Preston deserves a woman who understands ambition. Kinsley comes from a good family, she knows how to host a proper gala, and she will not embarrass us by wearing worn-out flannel to a charity dinner. It is about time he upgraded his life and secured his legacy. Sitting miles away in my secure hotel command center, I remained perfectly still. My heart rate stayed locked at a steady, resting pace. I did not feel a pang of sorrow watching them carelessly discard my personal property. Every item they threw away was just another string they were cutting, freeing me to execute my retaliation without any lingering attachments. They were practically vibrating with joyous entitlement, believing they were clearing the path for their golden child to claim his ultimate victory. They thought the house belonged to Preston. They had no idea they were committing forced entry and vandalism on a property legally owned by my corporate holding firm. As the camera panned slightly, catching the edge of the foyer, a third figure came into view. Preston possessed a younger brother named Colin, who lingered nervously near the coat rack. Colin was a sharp contrast to the arrogant swagger of his parents and sibling. At 28 years old, he worked as a junior accountant at the same healthcare logistics firm where Preston served as a regional director. Colin constantly looked as though he was waiting for the sky to fall. His shoulders were hunched, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of a modest wool jacket. I studied Colin on the glowing screen. During my suffocating tenure in their family, Colin was the only one who ever displayed a fraction of human decency. I remembered small pebbles of kindness. When Diane openly mocked my simple cooking at Thanksgiving, Colin was the one who quietly complimented the meal and stayed late to help me wash the dishes. When Preston ignored my birthday to play golf, Colin slipped a thoughtful handwritten card under my door. He was a terrified pawn, caught in a relentless psychological meat grinder, dominated by a father who demanded perfection and a brother who stole all the oxygen in the room. A tactical hypothesis formed in my mind. Colin processed the daily ledgers at the healthcare firm. Preston had just embezzled $200,000 and routed it through those exact same corporate accounts to cover an offshore gambling debt. Preston was not an accounting genius. He was a reckless opportunist. He would need someone on the inside to manipulate the spreadsheets and hide the glaring deficit before the quarterly audit. He would need someone he could easily bully into submission. He would need his little brother. I decided to test Colin and verify his loyalty. I needed to know if he was a willing accomplice in his brother's criminal syndicate or a hostage desperate for an exit strategy. I opened a specialized communication interface on my laptop. It utilized an untraceable routing protocol, ensuring the origin of the message could never be pinpointed. I drafted a highly encrypted self-destructing text message aimed directly at his personal cell phone. I did not write a lengthy emotional plea. I did not ask him how he could betray me. I simply typed a single, terrifying line of internal accounting code. It was the exact alphanumeric routing sequence Preston used to funnel the stolen money into the Cayman Islands. Underneath the sequence, I added 3 simple words: I see everything. I hit send. On the video feed, Diane was currently holding up one of my favorite knitted scarves, laughing a harsh, grating laugh before dropping it into the trash bag. Edward was dismantling a lamp I had purchased at a local artisan market. Neither of them noticed Colin standing in the hallway. I watched closely as the young accountant shifted his weight. A faint buzz echoed through the audio feed. Colin pulled his smartphone from his jacket pocket. The reaction was instantaneous and profound. Colin stared at the glowing screen of his device. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost illuminated by the harsh foyer lighting. His mouth fell open in sheer, unadulterated panic. His hands began to shake so severely that he almost dropped the phone. The single line of code was a lethal injection to his nervous system. It proved that the fraudulent ledger he had been forced to alter was no longer a secret. It proved someone was watching the money. Colin, you are just standing there, like a statue. Diane snapped, turning around and placing her hands on her hips. Grab a box and start clearing out the kitchen cabinets. We do not have all day. Colin did not answer her. He looked up, staring blankly at his mother. His breathing turned rapid and shallow. Without saying a single word, he dropped the flattened cardboard box he was holding. It hit the hardwood floor with a soft slap. He turned on his heel, threw open the heavy front door, and sprinted out into the freezing New Hampshire snowstorm, leaving the door wide open behind him. Diane shouted his name, her voice shrill with sudden irritation, but Colin was already gone. Edward grumbled something about his son lacking a spine and walked over to push the door shut. I smiled, watching the flawless execution of my digital strike. The panic in his eyes confirmed my hypothesis. Colin knew about the money. He knew about the altered corporate books. I did not have to wait long for the subsequent fallout. Less than 5 minutes later, a cheap disposable burner phone sitting on my hotel desk began to vibrate. The screen displayed an unknown, restricted number. I reached out and picked up the device, pressing it to my ear. I did not offer a greeting. I just listened to the heavy, ragged breathing on the other end of the line. Joy Colin whispered, his voice cracking with sheer terror. "I know it was you. I know you sent that message. Please do not hang up. I am sitting in my car, pulled over on the side of the highway, and I feel like I am going to throw up." I kept my tone level, projecting a sterile, clinical authority. "You read the code, Colin. You know what it means." He let out a choked, desperate sob. "Preston is out of his mind, Joy. He told me he was just borrowing a small amount to secure a condo for Kinsley. But the numbers kept growing. He has a gambling problem. A staggering offshore deficit. The bookies were threatening to expose him, so he started skimming from the logistical supply accounts. He forced me to cook the corporate books to hide the missing capital. He said if I did not help him, our father would lose his retirement fund because Edward co-signed the bridge loan. I am trapped in a federal nightmare, and I do not know how to get out." I closed my eyes, visualizing the interconnected web of financial ruin Preston had woven around his entire family. He had not just stolen my savings. He had actively chained his father and his brother to a sinking ship, expecting them to drown quietly to preserve his arrogant illusion of success. Colin had just handed me the master key to their destruction. I held the ultimate inside leverage, and the game was about to escalate into a full-scale hostile takeover. The neon sign of the roadside diner buzzed with a erratic electrical hum, casting a flickering red glow across the snow-packed parking lot. Located just off the northbound interstate, the establishment was a fading relic of mid-century Americana. It smelled of burnt filter coffee, industrial bleach, and decades of fried grease. I chose a secluded booth in the far back corner, sitting with my back against the cracked vinyl wall so I maintained a clear line of sight to the main entrance. Outside, the harsh New Hampshire winter continued to bury the state under a thick layer of frost. Inside, I waited with the calculated stillness of a predator. 10 minutes later, the front door swung inward, bringing a sharp gust of Arctic wind into the dining room. Colin stepped over the threshold, stamping his snow-covered boots against the rubber floor mat. He looked entirely worn down. The usual nervous energy he carried at family gatherings had mutated into sheer panic. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his shoulders slumped beneath his heavy wool coat. He scanned the room, his gaze darting past the few weary truckers hunched over the counter, until he locked eyes with me. He hurried over and slid into the booth opposite mine. His breathing was shallow and uneven. Without offering a greeting, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, brushed steel flash drive. He placed it on the sticky Formica table and slid it slowly across the surface until it touched the edge of my coffee saucer. That tiny piece of metal contained the encrypted digital footprint of a collapsing empire. I kept my hands resting gently in my lap, observing the profound fear radiating from his posture. He wrapped his trembling fingers around a ceramic mug of water the waitress had dropped off earlier, gripping it as if it were a life preserver. "Preston is dragging all of us into a grave," Colin whispered, his voice cracking under the strain. He told me the stolen cash from your joint account was just a temporary fix to secure a luxury condo, but the math did not add up. I am a junior accountant. I process the daily ledgers for the entire regional branch. I started digging into the routing numbers after you sent that text message. The deficit is staggering, Joy. I leaned forward slightly, letting the ambient noise of the clattering diner plates mask our conversation. I knew about the offshore gambling debt, I stated, keeping my tone sterile and clinical. He funneled the capital through the healthcare firm to pay his bookies in the Cayman Islands. Cullen shook his head, a hollow, defeated laugh escaping his throat. That was just the catalyst. Our firm is scheduled for a comprehensive corporate audit next month. The regional directors requested an external forensic accounting team to review our quarterly spending. When Preston received the notification, he panicked. He needed liquid capital immediately to replenish the missing corporate funds before the auditors arrived. The pieces of the puzzle began to snap together in my mind, forming a terrifying portrait of a man blinded by his own towering ego. He could not secure a legitimate business loan due to his hidden offshore liabilities. He needed a proxy. He needed a victim. He went to our father. Colin continued, swallowing hard. Preston convinced Edward to sign a stack of documents under the guise of an innocuous real estate investment opportunity. But I pulled the digital copies from his secure server this morning. Preston leveraged Edward's entire retirement portfolio to secure a fraudulent bridge loan. He forged the secondary authorization signatures and pledged our parents' financial future as direct collateral. He used their life savings to plug the hole in the corporate accounts. I processed the gravity of the revelation. Preston was not merely destroying our marriage to upgrade his social status. He was actively incinerating his own bloodline. He had anchored his parents to a toxic debt bomb, fully expecting them to absorb the blast when the authorities eventually unraveled his scheme. And now he needs you to finalize the illusion, I deduced, tracing the edge of my coffee saucer. He needs an insider to manipulate the upcoming tax filings so the incoming bridge loan appears as legitimate corporate revenue. Collins squeezed his eyes shut, a single tear cutting through the exhaustion on his face. He cornered me in my office yesterday. He said if I did not alter the logistics firm's tax documents, the auditors would find the initial deficit. He told me that if he goes down for embezzlement, the bank will immediately seize our parents' retirement accounts to cover the fraudulent loan. He is holding our family hostage. He made me a federal accomplice, Joy. If I sign those tax filings, I will go to prison right alongside him. I stared at the terrified young man sitting across from me. He was trapped in a psychological vice, forced to choose between his own freedom and his parents' financial survival. Preston had calculated that Colin's ingrained loyalty and chronic anxiety would guarantee his silence. My husband had profoundly underestimated the breaking point of a desperate man. I reached out and placed my hand firmly over the steel flash drive. The cold metal grounded my focus. I shed the facade of the discarded, heartbroken wife and adopted the unyielding posture of a chief executive officer. You are not going to prison, Colin, I said, my voice projecting a steady, undeniable authority. And you are not going to sign those fraudulent tax filings. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with confusion. You do not understand the leverage he has. If I blow the whistle, my parents lose everything they spent 40 years building. They are going to lose it anyway, I replied, cutting through his remaining illusions with surgical precision. Preston's gambling debts are a bottomless pit. He will drain that bridge loan, and when the auditors inevitably discover the altered routing numbers, the federal government will freeze every asset tied to his name. The bank will foreclose on your parents regardless of what you do. The only variable left to control is your own survival. I slid the flash drive off the table and dropped it into my coat pocket. I am offering you an exit strategy, I continued. My cybersecurity firm employs a division of elite corporate defense attorneys. They specialize in negotiating immunity deals for whistleblowers in white-collar federal investigations. If you cooperate with me, I will ensure my legal team shields you from any criminal liability regarding the altered ledgers. Cullen blinked his brain, struggling to reconcile my words with the quiet woman he had known for 6 years. Your cybersecurity firm, he repeated, the confusion evident in his strained whisper. Preston said you worked a dead-end help desk job. Preston is a fool who believes his own lies, I countered smoothly. I architect digital security systems for global financial institutions. I have the resources, the capital, and the legal infrastructure to dismantle your brother's syndicate, but I require a constant flow of intelligence. I need you to act as a double agent. You will return to the office, pretend to comply with his demands, and feed me the daily internal audit logs. You will document every conversation, forward every encrypted email, and provide me with the exact timestamps of his transactions. I paused, letting the weight of the offer settle in the space between us. When the dust clears and the federal indictments are handed down, you will have a lucrative, secure position waiting for you in the compliance department of my firm. You will walk away clean. The diner fell quiet around us, save for the rhythmic clatter of silverware from a nearby table. Colin stared at his trembling hands, weighing the immense risk against the promise of salvation. He realized I was not a victim seeking emotional revenge. I was a predator executing a hostile corporate takeover of his brother's life. I will do it, Colin breathed, his shoulders dropping as a wave of profound relief washed over him. I will get you the audit logs. Just get me out of this nightmare. We sat in silence for a brief moment. The contract forged in the dim light of the roadside booth. The suffocating tension that had gripped him seemed to dissipate, replaced by the grim determination of survival. I reached for my coffee, preparing to outline our secure communication protocols. Before I could speak, the heavy glass door at the front of the diner swung open. The cheerful, high-pitched chime of the entrance bell sliced through the quiet atmosphere. A rush of freezing winter air swept through the room, carrying a sudden, overpowering wave of expensive floral perfume that instantly clashed with the scent of fried grease. I shifted my gaze toward the entryway. Kinsley stood on the threshold, bringing the harsh, arrogant reality of my husband's new life directly into my sanctuary. She was dripping in designer winter wear, sporting a pristine white fur-trimmed coat and high-end leather ski boots that had never touched an actual mountain. A group of her equally polished friends trailed behind her, laughing loudly and shaking snow from their designer beanies. They looked entirely out of place in the gritty working-class establishment, treating the diner like a quaint, ironic backdrop for their social media feeds. Kinsley pulled off her oversized sunglasses and scanned the narrow dining room. Her eyes swept past the tired truckers and the weary waitstaff searching for an open table. Then her gaze landed on the secluded back booth. Her mocking smile faltered for a fraction of a second as she registered my face. Her eyes darted to Colin sitting across from me, absorbing the visual of the discarded wife holding a secretive meeting with her new boyfriend's brother. The initial shock evaporated rapidly, replaced by a radiant, toxic smirk. She squared her shoulders, whispered something to her friends, and began marching straight toward our table, the sharp click of her boots echoing like a countdown timer. The sharp clack of pristine leather boots striking the scuffed linoleum floor echoed like a metronome counting down to a disaster Kinsley could not foresee. She navigated the narrow diner aisle with her chin tilted upward, her posture radiating an unearned superiority. A heavy white fur coat draped over her shoulders, practically glowing under the flickering fluorescent ceiling fixtures. The waitstaff and weary truck drivers turned their heads, watching the glaring anomaly disrupt their quiet evening. She ignored them entirely, her predatory gaze locked firmly on my corner booth. Colin shrank back against the cracked vinyl seating. His knuckles turned a stark white as he gripped his ceramic water mug, terrified that his brother's new partner would uncover our clandestine meeting. I did not flinch. I maintained a relaxed, upright posture, my hands resting loosely on the sticky Formica table. "Well, isn't this a fascinating little family reunion?" Kinsley sneered, stopping just inches from the edge of our table. Her voice carried a nasal grating pitch that sliced through the ambient hum of the roadside establishment. She crossed her arms, bringing her wrist deliberately into my line of sight. As she shifted her weight, a dazzling sequence of refracted light caught my eye. Wrapped around her slender wrist was a tennis bracelet embedded with dozens of immaculate, oversized diamonds. The jewels caught the harsh diner lighting, throwing fractured prisms across the scratched tabletop. It was a staggering display of leveraged hollow wealth. The glittering stones represented everything my husband valued: fragile facades and stolen capital. In stark contrast, I sat, wearing a thick, unbranded wool sweater. I did not require shimmering accessories to validate my existence. My authentic autonomy was buried deep within encrypted offshore trusts, invisible to the naked eye, but entirely impenetrable. Kinsley looked down at my practical winter clothing, her lips curling into a venomous smirk. "Preston warned me you lacked basic taste," Kinsley taunted, leaning closer so the cloying scent of synthetic vanilla perfume overwhelmed the smell of burnt filter coffee. "He said you always dressed like a lumberjack. I suppose this greasy spoon diner is your natural habitat. It certainly fits your budget now that he cut off your credit cards." I suppressed the immediate instinct to defend myself. Emotional reactions are vulnerabilities, and I do not expose my flank to amateurs. Instead, I casually slid my right hand into my coat pocket. My thumb traced the textured edge of my smartphone, finding the side button. With two rapid, silent clicks, I engaged the concealed audio recording application. Colin stared at the table, a bead of cold sweat tracing a path down his temple. Kinsley noticed his discomfort and laughed a cruel, ringing sound. "Do not look so scared, Colin," she mocked, patting his shoulder with patronizing force. "Preston will not be mad. You are talking to the charity case. He is in too good of a mood. The contractors are coming tomorrow to rip out her hideous, rustic kitchen at the lake house. We are installing imported Italian marble. It is going to be our perfect private sanctuary." She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a sleek silver smartphone. Without asking permission, she thrust the device forward and aimed the dual lenses directly at my face. The bright flash blinded me for a fraction of a second, leaving a temporary purple halo in my vision. I just had to capture this moment. Kinsley gloated, her fingers flying across the digital keyboard as she typed a caption. "Preston is going to love seeing the woman he finally dumped sitting in a dingy truck stop while we pick out luxury fixtures for our new cabin. He told me you practically cried on your knees begging to stay. It is honestly just pathetic." During her obnoxious display, Kinsley had shoved her arm incredibly close to my face to secure the camera angle. The proximity provided a flawless, microscopic view of the tennis bracelet. My trained eyes scanned the intricate white gold setting, immediately identifying a distinct, interlocking hexagonal clasp. It was the signature trademark of a highly exclusive jewelry boutique located in downtown Boston. Kinsley slipped her phone back into her purse, looking immensely satisfied with her fabricated victory. She spun on her heel and strutted back toward her waiting entourage, near the entrance, her designer coat swishing with dramatic flair. She left behind a suffocating cloud of vanilla and the lingering echo of her unearned arrogance. The heavy glass door chimed as her group exited into the freezing night, leaving the diner plunging back into its standard, weary silence. Colin let out a long, ragged exhale, burying his face in his hands. "She is going to tell him she saw me," he whispered, his voice trembling with renewed panic. "Preston is going to know I crossed him." I withdrew my hand from my pocket and saved the audio file to a secure cloud server. "He will not have time to care about your whereabouts," I stated, opening my leather messenger bag and retrieving my titanium laptop. I placed the sleek machine on the table and powered it on. Colin watched in stunned silence as the screen illuminated my face. I connected to a decentralized virtual private network, masking my location and establishing a secure tunnel. I needed to trace the origin of those diamonds. I navigated to the administrative portal of the Boston boutique I had recognized. High-end jewelers rarely employ top-tier digital security, relying instead on physical vault doors and armed guards. Their digital inventory management software was a glaring vulnerability. Using a zero-day exploit I'd coded 3 years ago, I bypassed the rudimentary firewall in 11 seconds. I dropped into their unencrypted sales registry and executed a targeted query. I filtered the database for recent transactions featuring the distinct hexagonal clasp design, narrowing the geographic parameters to match my husband's billing zip code. The internal ledger populated instantly, highlighting a single transaction completed just 48 hours prior. The purchase price was a staggering $50,000. I clicked on the digital receipt, expanding the payment details. The name on the billing invoice was not Preston's personal checking account. The payment method listed a 16-digit corporate credit card issued explicitly by his healthcare logistics firm. The pieces locked into place, forming a flawless sequence of undeniable guilt. Preston had not merely diverted cash to his offshore bookies. He was utilizing company credit lines to purchase luxury jewelry for his mistress. By funneling corporate funds into personal, high-value assets, he had explicitly violated the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, committing a severe degree of corporate embezzlement that carried mandatory federal prison time. More importantly, the discovery fundamentally altered Kinsley's legal standing. She assumed she was just an innocent bystander, enjoying the spoils of a wealthy boyfriend. However, by accepting, wearing, and publicly flaunting $50,000 in stolen corporate assets, she had legally transformed herself into a direct recipient of illicit funds. The arrogant photograph she just took, combined with the audio recording of her boasting about the lakeside cabin, provided the exact physical evidence required to classify her as a federal co-conspirator. I downloaded the raw transaction data, appending the jewelry receipt, the digital audit logs, and the covert audio file into my encrypted federal dossier. Kinsley thought she was parading her ultimate victory over a broken wife. In reality, she had just fitted herself for a matching pair of federal handcuffs. "You found something," Colin observed, watching the rapid sequence of code cascading across my monitor. "I found the rope they are going to use to hang themselves," I replied, closing the database and wiping my digital footprint from the jeweler's server. A cold sense of profound satisfaction settled over my shoulders. The trap was meticulously baited, and the targets were willingly marching into the steel jaws. But the tranquility of the moment was abruptly shattered by a harsh, urgent chime emitting from my secured email dashboard. I minimized the terminal window and opened my encrypted inbox. A high-priority notification sat at the top of the queue, forwarded directly by my lead corporate counsel in Boston. I clicked the subject line, feeling a sudden, unexpected spike in my heart rate. The email contained a terrifying update. Preston had not settled for a standard local attorney. He had retained Nathaniel Reed, a notoriously vicious litigator renowned for financially gutting opposing spouses through relentless, suffocating legal warfare. Reed was a predator who specialized in scorched earth tactics, and he had just initiated his opening salvo. I opened the attached portable document format file. It was an emergency judicial motion submitted to the family court mere minutes ago. Preston and his new bulldog lawyer had petitioned the judge to enact an immediate, comprehensive freeze on every single financial asset bearing my name. They alleged I was a flight risk, planning to siphon marital funds. My husband was actively attempting to cut off my financial air supply before I could launch a counterstrike. If a judge granted that motion in the morning, my access to the holding company accounts could be tied up in bureaucratic red tape for months, leaving me paralyzed in the middle of a war zone. The stakes had just multiplied, demanding an immediate, flawless retaliation. The glaring white light of the emergency judicial motion reflected off the dark windows of my hotel suite. Nathaniel Reed was not merely a divorce attorney. He operated as a legal butcher within the New Hampshire family court system. His reputation centered on financially suffocating opposing spouses before they even had an opportunity to secure representation. By petitioning the judge to freeze my assets, Reed intended to paralyze my defense, leaving me stranded in a hotel room with declining credit lines and zero leverage. Before I could formulate a countermeasure to the asset freeze, a secondary notification chimed from my encrypted inbox. It was an email originating directly from Reed's law firm. The subject line read, "Expedited settlement offer and waiver of claims." I opened the attached digital document. The 50-page contract was a masterclass in predatory litigation. Reed had drafted an agreement designed to strip me of my dignity while simultaneously binding me to a sinking ship. The opening pages offered a pathetic $5,000 payout. It was a calculated insult framed as a generous relocation stipend to help the discarded wife secure a cheap rental apartment. However, the true danger lurked deep within the dense legal jargon of Section 4. I scrolled down, my eyes scanning the text with the practiced efficiency of a code auditor searching for malware. There it was. Buried beneath paragraphs dividing our meager household furnishings sat a toxic indemnification clause. The provision stipulated that by accepting the $5,000 I legally agreed to, assume equal responsibility for all outstanding marital debt acquired during the final year of our union. To a layperson, that might sound like a standard division of shared credit cards. To me, it read like a death warrant. Preston had artificially inflated our marital debt by leveraging his father's retirement accounts to secure that fraudulent bridge loan. If I signed this document, I would become legally liable for half of the stolen capital he funneled into his offshore gambling syndicate. He was trying to hand me the bill for his federal crimes. My cell phone buzzed on the glass desk. A text message from Preston illuminated the screen. "Reed sent the offer over. Sign it tonight. If you try to fight me on this, the judge will freeze your accounts tomorrow morning and you will not even have gas money. Take the $5,000 and disappear. It is the best deal you are ever going to get." He was wielding the threat of the asset freeze like a blunt instrument trying to force a panicked signature. He wanted me terrified, desperate, and compliant. Instead, a profound sense of clarity washed over me. Preston and his high-priced lawyer assumed I was an uneducated target. They viewed this settlement as a trap. I viewed it as an unpolished weapon waiting to be turned back against the wielder. I picked up my secure satellite phone and dialed a private number. The call routed through 3 distinct encrypted servers before ringing in a high-rise office building located in the heart of Boston's financial district. My corporate legal team did not handle trivial suburban divorces. They were apex predators, specializing in hostile corporate takeovers, intellectual property litigation, and complex liability defense. The lead partner answered on the second ring. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I forwarded the settlement document directly to his secure server and outlined the precise parameters of my counterstrike. I instructed him to weaponize Preston's own contract. "We need a poison pill," I explained, keeping my tone sterile and focused. Reed included a blanket indemnification clause to force me into sharing Preston's fraudulent bridge loan. I want that clause reversed, amplified, and buried so deep in the metadata that his paralegals will gloss right over it. My attorney understood the assignment instantly. His team went to work dismantling the digital file. They drafted a devastating cross-collateralization provision. The new language explicitly stated that by executing the agreement, Preston formally waived all future rights to bankruptcy protection. Furthermore, the clause legally bound him to assume sole personal liability for any and all corporate fraud, undisclosed liabilities, or offshore debts tied to his accounts. The brilliance of the maneuver lay in the execution. If we sent back a document with track changes enabled or obvious redline edits, Reed would spot the trap immediately. Instead, my legal team engaged in a digital sleight of hand. They meticulously manipulated the kerning, the line spacing, and the margin borders of the entire 50-page document. They injected the lethal paragraph into the exact center of the most boring, boilerplate section of the contract, ensuring the page count and visual structure remained identical to Reed's original draft. To the naked eye, the contract looked pristine. It appeared as though I had simply downloaded their file, added my electronic signature to the final page, and submitted it back to them. 20 minutes later, the altered document arrived in my inbox. I opened my email client to compose the response. This required a flawless performance. I had to feed Preston's towering ego, offering him the exact submissive victory he craved. I typed slowly, carefully, selecting words that projected total defeat. Preston, you win. I cannot afford to fight you and Nathaniel Reed in court. I am terrified of the judge freezing my checking account tomorrow. I need the $5,000 just to put down a deposit on a rental. I signed the paperwork. Please just wire the relocation money so I can move on. I attached the weaponized file and hit send. The silence that followed was deafening. I sat alone in the Portsmouth Hotel suite, the glow of the monitors casting long shadows against the cedar-paneled walls. I engaged a pixel tracking software embedded within the email, allowing me to monitor the exact second the file was opened. The trap was laid, but the risk was staggering. Nathaniel Reed billed $1,000 an hour for his services. If he tasked a competent paralegal with running the returned document through a basic text comparison software, the hidden cross-collateralization clause would light up in bright red ink. Reed would alert the judge, the asset freeze would take immediate effect, and my $80 million fortune would be locked behind impenetrable judicial red tape. I would lose my tactical advantage entirely. I stared at the screen, my heart beating in a slow, rhythmic cadence. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The tension thickened the air in the room, pressing against my ribs. I pictured Preston sitting in his temporary luxury rental, swirling a glass of expensive bourbon, gloating to Kinsley about how easily he broke me. I imagined him forwarding my pathetic email to Reed, laughing at my desperation. A green notification pinged on my tracking dashboard. The email had been opened. The IP address logged back to Reed's law firm. My breath caught in my throat. This was the critical juncture. The predator was inspecting the bait. If Reed read page 27, the game was over. I watched the digital seconds tick by on my taskbar. I knew the psychology of arrogant men. They rely heavily on their own perceived superiority. Reed expected me to cower. Preston expected me to surrender. Neither of them possessed the humility required to double-check their own flawless victory. Suddenly, a sharp, distinct chime echoed from my encrypted inbox. My hands hovered over the keyboard. I opened the incoming message. It was an automated notification from the digital signature platform utilized by the law firm. The subject line read, "Document executed." I clicked the link downloading the finalized certificate. I scrolled directly to the final page. There, resting above the notary stamp, was Preston's digital signature. He had signed the counteroffer. He had authorized the execution of the contract without reading a single page of the updated text. A cold, profound sense of satisfaction settled into my bones. He thought he was tossing me out with the trash. Instead, he had just legally chained himself to a sinking ship, waiving his right to a life jacket. He assumed sole responsibility for the embezzled healthcare funds, the offshore gambling debt, and the fraudulent loans. The federal cage was now officially sealed, and he was holding the padlock. I leaned back in my chair, allowing a rare, chilling smile to surface. The legal foundation of his life was destroyed. Now it was time to step out of the shadows and obliterate his social standing. I closed the legal files and opened the calendar application on my desktop. The region's most prestigious healthcare charity gala was scheduled for tomorrow evening in the White Mountains, and I needed to prepare my grand entrance. The grand ballroom of the Mount Washington Resort glowed under the warm light of a dozen towering crystal chandeliers. Situated deep within the rugged alpine peaks, this exclusive venue hosted the premier philanthropic event of the New Hampshire winter season. It gathered the elite tier of the regional healthcare sector, bringing together hospital executives, logistics directors, and old money socialites. For Preston, this charity gala was his ultimate coronation. He viewed the evening as the perfect stage to officially debut his new life. From my secure hotel suite, I monitored his digital check-in. I could easily picture him standing near the towering champagne fountain, thriving in the opulent environment. He would be wearing a tuxedo purchased on fraudulent credit, holding court with local politicians, and pretending to be a titan of industry. Kinsley would be clinging to his arm, showing off her stolen diamond tennis bracelet, eager to cement her status as a wealthy power couple. Diane and Edward were undoubtedly hovering nearby, boasting to anyone who would listen about their son and his boundless success. They were busy erasing my existence from their family history, rewriting the narrative to paint me as a pathetic, unmotivated burden they had finally discarded. They thought they owned the mountain tonight. They had no idea I held the deed to the entire landscape. I closed my laptop and stood up, stepping in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror. The reflection staring back at me was devoid of the quiet, unassuming help desk worker they all loved to belittle. My elite styling team had finished their work, leaving behind a towering predator. I wore a custom midnight sapphire gown that clung to my frame, flowing downward like liquid glass. The deep blue silk caught the ambient light, projecting a cool, undeniable authority. I reached into the leather lockbox, transported from my private vault, and retrieved a vintage diamond collar. The stones were pristine, unblemished and authentic, carrying a silent, generational weight that leveraged debt could never replicate. I fastened the clasp, feeling the cold, heavy jewels settle against my collarbone. I paired it with matching teardrop earrings and slipped on a pair of sharp stiletto heels. Real wealth does not need to scream for attention, but tonight it was going to make a definitive, undeniable statement. The drive up the winding mountain roads in my chauffeured black SUV provided ample time to regulate my pulse. The heater hummed, pushing back against the bitter alpine frost, while the dark silhouettes of pine trees blurred past the tinted windows. I focused on my breathing, entering a state of total tactical detachment. The vehicle crunched to a smooth halt on the frozen cobblestone driveway of the resort. A uniformed valet rushed forward, opening my door. The crisp mountain air hit my bare shoulders, sending a sharp thrill through my veins. I handed the young man a crisp $100 bill and walked up the grand staircase, leaving my driver to idle in the VIP staging area. I handed my invitation to the attendant stationed at the heavy mahogany doors. He glanced at the embossed card, his eyes widening slightly, before he bowed and pulled the brass handles outward. I stepped over the threshold into the ballroom. A live string quartet was playing a soft, classical arrangement near the center stage. The room buzzed with the overlapping chatter of hundreds of affluent guests. Then, the visual transition occurred. It started with a cluster of hospital board members standing near the entryway. They stopped mid-sentence, their champagne flutes hovering in the air as their eyes tracked my movement. The silence cascaded across the room, sweeping through the crowd like a shockwave. The ambient noise plummeted, leaving only the haunting melody of the cellos. Hundreds of heads turned. I walked forward with lethal grace, the sapphire silk trailing behind me. I scanned the sea of formal wear until my gaze locked onto my targets. Preston was standing near the ice sculpture mid-laugh. When his eyes finally registered my presence, his body seized. His hand froze in mid-air, and the crystal glass he held tilted sideways. Expensive champagne spilled over the rim, splashing directly onto his polished leather shoes. He did not even blink. His jaw hung slack, his brain entirely failing to process the visual data. He expected a broken woman, crying in a cheap motel. Instead, he was staring at an apex predator draped in millions of dollars of authentic jewelry. Kinsley stood right next to him, her smug demeanor evaporating into thin air. Her eyes darted frantically from my flawless diamond collar down to her own wrist. The stark contrast between my authentic capital and her illicit leveraged bracelet hit her like a physical blow. Her complexion turned a sickly shade of pale envy as she recognized the vast, unbridgeable canyon between pretend luxury and actual power. Diane noticed the shifting atmosphere and detached herself from a group of local politicians. Her face twisted into a fierce scowl. She marched toward me, her heels striking the marble floor with rapid, hostile intent. She intended to intercept me before I could reach the center of the room, stepping directly into my path to block my momentum. "Joy, what on earth do you think you are doing here?" Diane hissed, keeping her voice low but thick with panic. Her expensive perfume failed to mask the scent of her rising terror. "You do not belong in this room. This gala is for donors and executives, not discarded tech support workers. Turn around and walk out those doors right now before I have security throw you into the snow." I did not break my stride, forcing Diane to take a clumsy step backward to avoid a physical collision. I stopped just inches from her face, looking down into her wide, trembling eyes. I offered her a chilling, razor-sharp smile. "Security works for the event sponsors, Diane," I replied, my voice smooth and projecting a sterile, clinical authority. "And since my anonymous holding company underwrote this entire evening, securing the venue, hiring the catering staff, and providing the primary charitable endowment, I highly doubt they will remove the guest of honor." Diane stopped breathing. The blood rushed out of her cheeks, leaving her makeup looking like a cheap mask painted on a ghost. Her mouth opened, but her vocal cords refused to produce a single sound. The reality of my words fractured her fragile social illusion. The woman she had tormented for years, the daughter-in-law she deemed a worthless peasant, owned the very ground she was standing on. Realizing his mother was losing the confrontation, Preston shoved his way through the stunned crowd. He pulled a cocktail napkin from a passing waiter and wiped a thick bead of sweat from his forehead. His tailored suit suddenly looked restrictive as his chest heaved with shallow, erratic breaths. "What is this?" Preston demanded, his voice cracking under the intense scrutiny of the surrounding elite guests. "Whose money did you steal to rent that dress, Joy? Did you blow the entire $5,000 settlement just to come here and stage a desperate stunt? You are making a fool of yourself." I tilted my head, studying the sheer desperation leaking from his pores. He was clinging to his fabricated narrative, terrified that the high society peers watching us would realize he was a fraud. "I did not rent a single thread, Preston Muck," I stated calmly, letting my words carry clearly to the silent audience gathered around us. "And I suggest you hold on to that settlement contract very tightly. It is the only thing keeping you out of a federal penitentiary right now." Before Preston could formulate a defense, the feedback of a microphone whined sharply from the main stage. The master of ceremonies, a distinguished local judge, stepped up to the podium and cleared his throat, demanding the room's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," the judge announced, his booming voice echoing off the gilded ceiling. We have an unprecedented adjustment to tonight's program. The primary benefactors of this evening's charity, who prefer to remain anonymous, have just submitted an emergency request to the Hospital Oversight Board. The crowd murmured, sensing the sudden shift in the evening's trajectory. Preston turned his head toward the stage, his eyes wide with mounting dread. Effective immediately, the judge continued, holding up a sealed manila folder. The benefactors have demanded a sudden, unannounced forensic audit of the Regional Healthcare Logistics Division. All corporate accounts managed by that branch have been placed under a temporary freeze pending a comprehensive federal review of vendor routing numbers and internal compliance. The heavy silence returned, suffocating the ballroom. The Regional Healthcare Logistics Division was Preston's exact department. The Master of Ceremonies had just publicly announced a financial lockdown on his specific sector, in front of his boss, his peers, and his local politicians. Preston staggered, taking a clumsy step backward as his knees visibly weakened. He looked at the stage, then back at my unblinking, serene expression. The trap was no longer a digital abstraction hidden on a computer screen. It had just manifested in the real world, wrapping tight around his throat while the entire state watched him gasp for air. The morning sun illuminated the frost covering the windows of my hotel suite, casting a bright, sterile light over my workstation. The fallout from the charity gala continued to unfold in digital silence. I monitored the corporate network traffic emanating from the regional healthcare firm. The Hospital Oversight Board had moved swiftly during the night hours, locking Preston out of his logistical division servers. His administrative access was revoked, pending an internal inquiry. He was trapped in a holding pattern, unable to manipulate the ledgers or cover his tracks. But a narcissist and their enablers rarely accept defeat without a theatrical display. Diane refused to acknowledge the reality of her collapsing world. She needed to reclaim control of her fractured social narrative. She sought refuge in the only environment where she felt untouchable. The Oak Ridge Country Club was an exclusive enclave built for old money and high society posturing. The sprawling estate featured vaulted mahogany ceilings, roaring stone fireplaces, and an atmosphere thick with entitlement. I knew her routine perfectly. Every Wednesday morning, she held court in the main dining room, surrounded by local politicians' wives and hospital board members. I arrived at the club 30 minutes before Diane, securing a secluded table partially obscured by a tall, potted fern. I wore a tailored ivory cashmere sweater and dark trousers, blending seamlessly into the affluent environment. I ordered a single espresso and waited. Soon enough, Diane strutted into the dining room. Her blonde hair was styled with rigid perfection, and she carried a designer handbag that cost more than a standard mortgage payment. She gathered her inner circle at a prime center table, acting as though the events of the previous evening were nothing but a minor inconvenience. I sat quietly, sipping the bitter dark roast coffee, letting the ambient acoustics of the dining room carry her voice directly to my ears. Diane was orchestrating a desperate smear campaign. She spoke just loud enough to ensure nearby patrons could hear her fabricated story. She told her wealthy friends that I was an unstable, broke ex-wife, prone to manic episodes. She claimed I had squandered a generous divorce settlement to rent a sapphire gown and hire a limousine, all in a pathetic attempt to extort more money from her highly successful son. Her peers nodded sympathetically, swirling their citrus mimosas, soaking up the fabricated drama. I rested my smartphone on the table, opening the secure, encrypted tunnel connected to my offshore servers. Colin had honored our diner agreement. Before dawn, he transmitted the unaltered tax filings and the original digital metadata pertaining to the fraudulent bridge loan Edward had co-signed. The evidence was pristine and undeniable. I ran a specialized routing script directing the audit logs straight to the automated compliance department of the financial institution holding Edward's collateral. Banking algorithms do not possess empathy. They operate on strict risk mitigation protocols. When the system detects a forged origination document tied directly to a primary guarantor, it initiates an immediate hard hold on all associated accounts to prevent capital flight. I tapped the screen, executing the data transfer. The digital strike moved silently through the banking infrastructure, seeking its target. At the center table, Diane flagged down the club manager. She wanted to finalize the details for an upcoming engagement luncheon for Preston and Kinsley. She loudly announced that she spared no expense when celebrating her son's new elevated relationship. A $10,000 catering deposit was required to secure the date. Diane opened her purse and retrieved a sleek, platinum credit card with a haughty flick of her wrist. She held the plastic high, ensuring her friends witnessed her effortless spending power. The manager approached her table, holding a portable payment terminal. He smiled politely, inputting the hefty transaction amount, and inserted the platinum chip. The machine processed for several seconds. A sharp, distinct beep pierced the polite chatter of the dining room. The manager frowned, apologizing for the delay, and attempted the transaction a second time. Another sharp beep echoed from the device. The screen displayed a harsh red error code. Diane sighed loudly, rolling her eyes at her friends to signal her annoyance with modern technology. She pulled a second premium card from her wallet, complaining about the tedious nature of fraud protection alerts. The manager inserted the new card with an apologetic nod. The terminal screen illuminated processing the request before flashing the exact same red error warning. The manager cleared his throat, his polite demeanor fracturing under the mounting awkwardness. He stepped closer to Diane, lowering his voice, but the sudden silence at the table amplified his words. He informed her that her financial institution had declined the transaction. Furthermore, the bank sent a direct automated alert to the merchant terminal, instructing them to confiscate the cards. He stated clearly that a strict federal hold had been placed on her entire portfolio due to suspicious activity. The women sitting around Diane froze. Their crystal glasses halted halfway to their lips. Whispers ignited instantly across the surrounding tables. The color drained from Diane's face. Her manicured fingers trembled as she stared at the useless plastic sitting on the table. She scanned the dining room, desperate to find a distraction from the suffocating public humiliation. Her frantic gaze swept past the stone fireplace and landed directly on my table. I lowered my porcelain cup to its saucer, maintaining unbroken eye contact. The realization crashed into her with the force of a speeding train. She abandoned her friends and her unpaid bill. Her heels clicked rapidly across the hardwood floor as she marched toward my secluded corner. Her breath was shallow and erratic, her chest heaving with rising panic. She leaned over my table, gripping the edges so tightly her knuckles turned white. She demanded to know what I did to her accounts, accusing me of hacking her bank and ruining her reputation. I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch. I looked at her with cool, detached indifference. I explained the sterile reality of financial liability. I told her that Preston had embezzled funds to pay an offshore gambling syndicate, and he used Edward's signature to secure a fraudulent bridge loan to cover his tracks. I detailed how a guarantor is inextricably bound to the primary borrower. When the primary borrower commits federal wire fraud, the bank protects its assets by freezing the guarantor's entire estate. Her husband tied their 40 years of accumulated wealth to a sinking ship. She struggled to pull air into her lungs, shaking her head in fierce denial. She called me a liar, insisting her son was a brilliant director and her husband would never leverage their home for a risky loan. She prepared to launch another string of insults to defend her fractured reality. Before she could speak, her cell phone chimed loudly from inside her designer handbag. She pulled the device out, her hands shaking so severely she nearly dropped it on the floor. It was a text message from Edward. I sat quietly watching her read the words glowing on the screen. Her eyes widened in pure, unfiltered terror. A raw, guttural scream ripped from her throat, echoing off the vaulted ceilings of the country club and silencing the entire establishment. Edward had just informed her that the bank officially initiated foreclosure proceedings on their family home. The digital dashboard in my Portsmouth hotel suite glowed with a steady stream of incoming data, casting a sterile blue light across the dark cedar walls. The localized freeze on Edward's bridge loan had triggered a rapid chain reaction throughout the regional banking infrastructure. I sat back in my ergonomic leather chair, watching the cascading effects of the financial lockdown. Preston was trapped in a tightening net. Colin had honored his end of our diner agreement and severed all contact with his brother. Every incoming call from Preston to Colin's phone routed directly to an automated voicemail service, standing as a silent testament to the young accountant's defection. The sudden isolation was pushing my husband toward his breaking point. It started as a subtle fluctuation on my secondary monitor. A network packet analyzer I had covertly installed on Preston's home router detected a sudden, staggering surge in encrypted traffic. The bandwidth consumption escalated at an unnatural rate. A standard user browsing the internet or streaming a movie generates a predictable flow of data. This was entirely different. This was the frantic, heavy transmission signature of secure file transfer protocols and offshore routing algorithms. Preston was scrambling. The walls of his fabricated kingdom were collapsing, and his survival instincts were finally overriding his towering ego. I tapped a sequence of keys isolating his specific internet protocol address and deploying a packet sniffer to unmask his digital destination. Before I decoded the financial endpoint, a secondary alert chimed from my surveillance software. The program intercepted an outgoing voice over internet protocol call originating directly from his laptop. I routed the audio through my headset, pressing the sleek headphones over my ears. Preston's voice filled the quiet room, breathless and tight, with sheer, unadulterated panic. He was speaking to an old college fraternity brother who specialized in questionable real estate ventures. The recording laid bare the stark, ugly reality of my husband's character. Preston confessed his crimes in a rushed, frantic whisper. He admitted the healthcare logistics deficit was unfixable. He confirmed the offshore bookies were demanding immediate payment, threatening severe retaliation if the debt remained unsettled. Then he delivered the ultimate betrayal, resolving the lingering question of his loyalty. He told his friend he was liquidating the remaining stolen capital and securing a one-way ticket to a non-extradition country. When his friend asked about Kinsley Preston, let out a harsh, bitter laugh. He called her a convenient distraction, a naive prop used to elevate his social status at company events. He explicitly stated his intention to abandon her in New Hampshire, leaving her holding the bag for the illicit diamond bracelet and the forged documents. The grand romance he had flaunted was a total sham. He intended to save himself and leave his young mistress to face the federal prosecutors alone. I disconnected the audio feed, feeling a profound chill settle over my shoulders. I returned my focus to his data transmission. Preston was attempting to launder the remaining $1.5 million of embezzled corporate funds. He was utilizing a dark web tumbling service, trying to convert the stolen fiat currency into an untraceable offshore cryptocurrency wallet. For years, he had mocked my profession. He loved to stand in the doorway of my home office, laughing at my dual monitors, calling my late-night coding sessions a pathetic attempt to play computer games while he did the real work in the corporate world. He was entirely unaware that during those specific late nights, I was coding an elite zero-day threat protection patent. That precise piece of software had recently sold to a global tech conglomerate for $80 million, securely funding my hidden holding company. He never possessed the intellectual capacity to understand that my keystrokes were architecting digital fortresses worth tens of millions of dollars. He viewed technology as a trivial hobby. I viewed it as a lethal weapon. I did not intend to let him leave the state. I pulled up a localized command terminal and began writing a targeted interception script. My fingers flew across the keyboard with clinical precision, bypassing his rudimentary virtual private network in less than 12 seconds. I injected a spoofed routing protocol directly into his data stream. As Preston clicked confirm on his tumbling service, my script hijacked the transaction midair. Instead of funneling the $1.5 million into his anonymous crypto ledger, I redirected the entire sum into a digital escrow account I had pre-staged months ago for high-level security audits. This specific escrow account was permanently tagged and monitored by the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Unit. By initiating the transfer, Preston unwittingly delivered the stolen capital straight into a federal holding pen. He created an undeniable time-stamped record of his money laundering attempt, handing the government flawless proof of his intent to conceal illicit assets. The moment the transfer cleared into the federal trap, my script executed its final command. I locked his machine entirely out of the network. Back at the lakeside cabin, Preston's computer screen froze. A glaring crimson error window consumed his display, broadcasting a fatal federal compliance code indicating the funds had been seized by government authorities. He was effectively paralyzed. His brilliant escape route evaporated into thin air, leaving him with zero liquid assets and an undeniable digital paper trail. I listened through the open microphone as he let out a guttural, agonizing scream of defeat. A loud crash echoed through the audio feed as he hurled something heavy against the timber wall of the cabin. Desperation obliterates logic, and his survival strategy fractured under the intense pressure. Having failed to secure his solo escape, he pivoted instantly. He dialed Kinsley's number in a blind panic. When she answered, his previous arrogant bravado vanished. He begged her to pack a bag immediately, frantically claiming the bank made a catastrophic error and they needed to drive across the Canadian border before dawn. He was using her as a human shield, hoping her presence might buy him enough time to cross international lines undetected. I logged out of the routing terminal and closed the surveillance feeds, allowing the quiet hum of the hotel suite to return to focus. The digital execution was flawless, but the physical repercussions were accelerating faster than anticipated. The federal tripwire I had established required precision timing to ensure the authorities directed their attention toward the true culprit. I stood up from my ergonomic chair, rolling my shoulders, to release the tension that had accumulated during the digital strike. The soft glow of the Portsmouth city streetlights filtered through the sheer curtains, offering a brief moment of tranquility. I walked toward the kitchenette, intending to pour a fresh cup of dark roast coffee to sustain my focus for the upcoming legal maneuvers. Before my hand reached the coffee pot, a loud, heavy knock shattered the silence of my room. The sound was authoritative, demanding immediate access. The solid wood of the door vibrated slightly under the force of the strike. I set my empty mug on the glass counter and walked slowly to the heavy mahogany door. The sudden arrival signaled an unexpected acceleration in the timeline. I peered through the security peephole, analyzing the threat. 2 individuals in dark structured suits stood in the hallway. Their posture radiated strict disciplinary training. The taller of the two held up an open leather wallet displaying a gleaming metal badge and identification credentials bearing the unmistakable seal of the federal government. The trap had snapped shut on Preston, but the resulting shockwave had reached my doorstep. The authorities had arrived to question me about the suspicious offshore activity tied to my husband's accounts, and I needed to pivot my strategy immediately. I swung the heavy mahogany door inward, keeping my posture relaxed but rigid. 2 individuals stood in the hotel corridor. The taller man held a leather credential wallet open, displaying a gleaming shield. Special Agent Thomas Vance, Federal Bureau of Investigation, White Collar Crime Division. Beside him stood Special Agent Sarah Jenkins, her gaze sharp and evaluating. They expected to find a hysterical spouse, someone who had just discovered their domestic life was a sham and their bank accounts were locked. I did not fit their psychological profile. I wore a tailored charcoal blazer over a crisp white blouse. My expression remained impassive. I stepped aside, gesturing toward the interior of the luxury suite. They walked into the room, their eyes scanning the environment. They noticed the dual monitors, the encrypted servers humming quietly on the desk, and the pristine order of the space. Vance cleared his throat, adopting a practiced, sympathetic tone. He started explaining that they were investigating suspicious offshore financial activities connected to my husband. He began detailing the flagged transaction trapped in the digital escrow account, speaking slowly, as if trying not to overwhelm a fragile civilian. I raised my hand, halting his rehearsed speech. I instructed them to take a seat at the glass dining table. Walking over to the reinforced steel lockbox resting in the corner of the room, I entered a 16-digit biometric passcode. The heavy lid unlatched with a satisfying click. I retrieved a thick black leather-bound binder. It was 500 pages of indexed forensic data. I carried the dense dossier to the dining table and dropped it onto the glass surface. The resulting thud silenced the room. I sat across from the agents, sliding the binder toward Vance. I informed them that everything they needed to secure a federal racketeering conviction was located between those leather covers. Jenkins opened the cover, her skepticism evident. That skepticism dissolved into stunned quiet as she turned the first few pages. I had categorized the evidence with surgical precision. The initial section contained the embezzlement flow, tracking every stolen dollar diverted from the healthcare logistics firm to the offshore gambling syndicates. The subsequent tab detailed the fraudulent bridge loan. I provided the forged signatures, the phantom mortgage documents, and the precise digital metadata proving Preston had leveraged a corporate holding company asset he did not own. I watched their eyes widen as they processed the depth of the intelligence. I directed their attention to the third section. Here I documented Kinsley's illicit luxury purchases. I included the serial number of the diamond tennis bracelet, cross-referenced with the corporate credit card receipts, proving the mistress was a willing recipient of stolen corporate funds. Finally, I pointed to the last section, which chronicled the exact timestamps, routing numbers, and digital footprints of the cryptocurrency laundering attempt Preston had executed mere minutes ago. Vance closed the binder, looking at me with a mixture of profound respect and sharp caution. He acknowledged the staggering volume of evidence. However, he raised the inevitable legal barrier. He stated that while the data was flawless, a competent defense attorney would have it tossed out of court if it was procured through unauthorized domestic surveillance or illegal hacking. The fruit of the poisonous tree doctrine would render the entire dossier inadmissible. He needed to know how a supposedly low-level tech support worker obtained restricted corporate financial ledgers without breaking a dozen federal privacy laws. I smiled, a cool, calculated expression that erased any lingering doubts about my capabilities. I reached into my blazer pocket and withdrew a single notarized sheet of heavy cardstock. I handed it to Vance. I explained the missing logical link that Preston had fatally overlooked. I am the lead architect and founder of an elite cybersecurity firm. 3 months ago, the board of directors overseeing Preston's healthcare company suspected internal financial hemorrhaging. They quietly retained my agency to conduct a highly covert penetration test and a comprehensive forensic audit of their regional branches. I let the realization sink in as Vance read the retainer agreement. The document contained the signatures of the executive board members explicitly granting me unrestricted legal authorization to access, monitor, and duplicate all data residing on their corporate servers. I did not hack Preston. I did not conduct illegal surveillance on his employer. I was a contracted corporate auditor performing my designated duties. Every keystroke, every intercepted ledger, and every downloaded receipt was obtained through legally sanctioned channels. The evidence was pristine, admissible, and entirely devastating. A slow, genuine smile spread across Agent Vance's face. The cautious federal investigator transformed into a predator who had just been handed an unassailable target. He looked at Jenkins, who gave a firm nod of agreement. They both recognized I had just delivered a textbook racketeering and wire fraud case, requiring zero preliminary legwork. Vance closed the portfolio and asked when I wanted them to execute the arrest warrants. He was ready to dispatch a tactical team to the lakeside cabin tonight. I shook my head, requesting a brief delay. I asked the agents to hold off on the physical arrests for exactly 48 hours. Vance frowned, questioning the tactical advantage of waiting when the suspect was an established flight risk. I clarified my strategy. Preston was indeed desperate, but his crypto escape route was permanently severed. He was cornered, operating under the delusion that he still retained a shred of legal leverage through his ruthless divorce attorney. I explained that the final divorce mediation was scheduled for the following morning. If the federal authorities arrested him tonight, he would invoke his right to remain silent, hiding behind whatever defense counsel the state provided. But if we let him walk into that civil courtroom believing he was untouchable, his towering ego would dictate his actions. He would arrogantly swear under oath that his financial disclosures were accurate. He would claim ownership of the forged assets on a recorded legal transcript. By delaying the raid, we would allow Preston to voluntarily commit severe perjury, cementing his guilt, and eradicating any potential plea deals his lawyers might attempt to negotiate. The logic was inescapable. Vance recognized the brilliance of the psychological maneuver. Capturing a white-collar criminal is one thing. Capturing him mere seconds after he perjures himself in front of a judge elevates the prosecution to an unwinnable scenario for the defense. The agents agreed to the 48-hour window. They stood up, shaking my hand with genuine professional reverence, assuring me they would position a strike team outside the courthouse doors, waiting for my signal. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut, leaving me alone in the quiet hotel suite once more. The physical components of my retribution were securely aligned with federal law enforcement. The board was set. I walked back to my glowing workstation, preparing to finalize the details for the morning mediation. As I settled into my chair, a sharp notification tone pierced the silence of the room. A new email had arrived in my encrypted inbox. The sender was Nathaniel Reed Preston's notoriously litigious attorney. The subject line was drafted in all capital letters, demanding immediate attention. I opened the message, my eyes scanning the brief, cocky text. Reed dispensed with professional formalities, adopting a sneering, condescending tone. He stated that the signed settlement was merely step one. He demanded I arrive at the courthouse tomorrow morning, prepared to surrender all remaining personal property, vehicles, and residual savings to cover Preston's supposed emotional distress. Reed concluded the email by promising to financially ruin me if I dared to contest a single line item during the mediation. He boasted that his client was holding all the cards and that my best option was unconditional surrender. I stared at the glowing words, my pulse remaining steady and cool. Preston and his high-priced lawyer were marching into a heavily fortified trap, utterly blind to the federal crosshairs painted squarely on their backs. The final confrontation was imminent, and they were about to discover the true cost of their arrogance. Dawn broke over the granite state with a biting crystalline frost. The icy veneer clinging to my hotel window mirrored the chilled, calculated rhythm of my heartbeat. Today marked the culmination of a meticulously engineered stratagem. I stood before the full-length mirror, stripping away the final remnants of the discarded subservient spouse. The faded flannel shirts and sensible denim were permanently banished from my wardrobe. In their place, I donned the uncompromising armor of a chief executive officer. I slipped into a sharp, bespoke charcoal suit, the structured shoulders and flawless tailoring projecting undeniable authority. I fastened a subtle platinum watch around my wrist, ensuring every external detail reflected the apex predator operating beneath the surface. I did not require heavy cosmetics or theatrical accessories. My leverage was forged in encrypted data and ironclad legal snares, not superficial posturing. I departed the suite and descended to the private business center located on the ground floor. Awaiting me was my lead corporate counsel, a ruthless litigator renowned for dismantling Fortune 500 conglomerates during hostile takeovers. He did not handle trivial domestic disputes, but he had eagerly accepted this assignment given the sheer scale of the financial deception involved. He sat at the polished conference table, a leather briefcase resting open before him. We exchanged a brief, curt nod. Emotional reassurance was unnecessary. Our dialogue consisted entirely of tactical confirmations. He handed me the printed affidavits detailing the federal racketeering charges, money laundering, timestamps, and the forged phantom mortgage documents. We reviewed the poison settlement contract one final time. The devastating cross-collateralization clause remained, flawlessly concealed within the metadata and margin formatting. The opposing counsel, notorious for his predatory tactics, had authorized the execution of the document without conducting a basic forensic review. By attempting to financially suffocate me, he had legally tethered his client to an inescapable anchor of non-dischargeable debt. The paperwork was pristine, bearing the official digital signatures required to enforce the trap. We transitioned our focus to the presiding authority of the upcoming mediation. A standard family court mediator might attempt to foster an amicable compromise, encouraging concessions to expedite the docket. I had anticipated that vulnerability. Through strategic legal filings, my counsel had successfully petitioned for a specific adjudicator. We secured a retired federal judge known for his draconian intolerance of perjury and white-collar deception. This magistrate possessed a reputation for dissecting financial disclosures with surgical precision. He viewed courtroom deception not as a minor infraction, but as a severe affront to the judicial system. He was the perfect mechanism to ignite the powder keg I had carefully assembled. A quiet vibration emanating from my smartphone interrupted the briefing. I tapped the screen, accessing a secure feed linked to the municipal courthouse exterior surveillance cameras. The high-definition video captured a sleek, leased luxury sedan pulling into the designated parking lot. The driver's side door swung open, and Preston stepped out onto the frosty pavement. He wore a tailored navy suit purchased with illicit capital, adjusting his lapels with a practiced, haughty flick of his wrists. Kinsley emerged from the passenger side, shivering in the crisp air, while clinging tightly to his arm. They walked toward the entrance, radiating a toxic, unearned confidence. Preston's body language broadcasted his delusional reality. He laughed heartily at something his young subordinate said, his chest puffed out, reveling in his perceived victory. Observing his strut, I could easily deduce his internal monologue. He genuinely believed he had backed me into an inescapable corner. He expected to find a weeping, defeated woman standing alone in the corridors devoid of legal representation. He assumed I was appearing without a lawyer, desperately clutching the $5,000 settlement check to stave off homelessness. He calculated that his aggressive attorney would bulldoze my meager defenses within 10 minutes, leaving him free to occupy my lakeside cabin and fund his new life with untraceable offshore crypto. He considered me a naive collateral casualty. He had no inkling that he was marching blindly toward a legal slaughterhouse, guided by a woman who commanded an $80 million empire. I closed the surveillance application and slid the device into my pocket. My attorney packed his leather briefcase, snapping the brass locks shut with a sharp, definitive click. We exited the hotel and entered the waiting town car. The journey to the courthouse proceeded in total silence. I utilized the brief transit to perform a final mental recalibration. I regulated my respiration, drawing the cold New Hampshire air into my lungs and exhaling any lingering tension. The grief associated with the death of my 6-year marriage had evaporated weeks ago, replaced by a crystalline, forensic detachment. I was no longer a spouse in mourning. I was the executioner of his impending ruin. The town car halted near the imposing stone pillars of the municipal building. I stepped out, my heels clicking rhythmically against the icy concrete steps. We bypassed the standard security lines, utilizing the expedited attorney entrance. The interior of the courthouse smelled of stale coffee floor wax and anxious desperation. We navigated the labyrinthine hallways, passing clusters of arguing couples and frazzled public defenders. I maintained a forward gaze, my posture rigid, ignoring the chaotic hum of the surrounding environment. We arrived at the heavy oak doors designated for alternative dispute resolution. The brass placard gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lighting. Behind this barrier, the final act of my orchestration awaited. I paused for a fraction of a second. I pictured the stolen funds, the sneering in-laws, and the counterfeit signatures used to hijack my property. I channeled every ounce of that betrayal into a sharp, diamond-hard focus. I reached forward and firmly pushed the brass handle downward. The heavy wooden portal swung inward, revealing the sterile interior of the conference room. The mediator had not yet arrived, leaving the opposing party unsupervised. Preston sat at the far end of the long mahogany table. His posture was the epitome of profound disrespect. He had pushed his chair back, casually propping his expensive leather shoes directly onto the polished wood surface. He was leaning backward, his hands laced behind his head, dictating instructions to his sleazy lawyer, who was frantically typing on a laptop. Kinsley occupied the corner chair, snapping her chewing gum, scrolling through her social media feed with a bored, entitled expression. They halted their activities the instant the door clicked shut behind me. Preston's eyes flicked toward the entrance, a mocking sneer already forming on his lips, ready to deliver a degrading insult to his broke, defenseless wife. But the sneer faltered as his gaze traveled upward, registering the bespoke charcoal suit, the icy composure, and the towering corporate litigator standing silently at my flank. He lowered his feet from the mahogany table, sitting up straighter as a flicker of profound confusion crossed his features. The dynamic in the room fractured instantly, paving the way for a deposition that would trap him in an inescapable snare of his own design. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, sealing us inside the sterile mediation chamber. Nathaniel Reed did not waste a single second establishing his perceived dominance over the room. He unbuttoned his tailored suit jacket, spread his thick manila folders across a wide section of the polished mahogany table, and leaned forward on his elbows. He was a predator, accustomed to cornering frightened prey. His entire litigation strategy relied on overwhelming the opposition with a rapid barrage of legal threats before they could mount a coherent defense. Reed began his opening statement with a condescending sigh. He looked at my attorney, then directed his gaze toward me, offering a pitying smirk. He launched into a lengthy, rehearsed monologue designed to portray me as a negligent, unmotivated spouse, dragging down a rising corporate star. He spun a fabricated narrative, detailing how his client Preston had single-handedly carried the financial burden of our marriage for 6 years. Reed claimed my wages from a dead-end tech support job were trivial, yet he insisted I was hiding those meager paychecks in secret personal accounts to avoid contributing to the household expenses. The audacity of his claims escalated with every sentence. Reed demanded I pay Preston ongoing spousal support to compensate for the profound emotional distress of dealing with my supposed financial negligence. He argued that Preston had grown accustomed to a specific standard of living, one he alleged I was actively sabotaging. Reed then shifted his intense focus to the lakeside cabin. He argued that Preston had maintained the property, funded the upkeep, and was therefore entitled to sole ownership of the real estate. Reed stated that granting his client the mountain retreat was a necessary concession to balance the scales of domestic equity. He painted Preston as a hard-working executive, victimized by an apathetic partner. In the far corner of the room, Kinsley sat slouched in a plush leather guest chair. She projected the aura of a lottery winner waiting to collect her grand prize. She snapped a piece of mint chewing gum with rhythmic, irritating consistency. Her legs were crossed, and she continually adjusted the sleeve of her designer winter coat to ensure the diamond tennis bracelet remained entirely visible. The jewels caught the harsh fluorescent lighting glittering against her wrist. It was a staggering display of ignorance. She was wearing stolen corporate funds into a legal proceeding, oblivious to the digital snare surrounding her. I remained perfectly still, my hands resting lightly in my lap. I did not interrupt Reed. I did not defend my career or roll my eyes at Kinsley's posturing. I sat in stoic silence, regulating my breathing, allowing their unchecked egos to inflate to maximum capacity. My corporate litigator sat beside me, mirroring my glacial composure. He held a sleek silver pen, jotting down an occasional note on a yellow legal pad, offering zero resistance to the opposing counsel's theatrical performance. Seated at the head of the long mahogany table was the mediator we had specifically requested. Honorable Marcus Sterling was a retired federal judge with 30 years of bench experience overseeing complex white-collar litigation. He possessed a stern-lined face and piercing gray eyes that tolerated zero courtroom theatrics. He sat with his hands folded, listening to Reed's monologue with an unreadable expression. In the center of the table, a red light blinked steadily on a digital audio recorder, documenting every spoken word for the official legal transcript. Once Reed finally paused to take a sip of water, Judge Sterling leaned forward. He explained that, due to the highly contested nature of the assets he required, all financial disclosures and settlement agreements to be placed on the official record, under oath. He instructed Preston to raise his right hand. Preston complied, a smug smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. He swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. He dropped his hand, settling back into his chair, treating the solemn judicial vow as a mere bureaucratic formality. He lacked any genuine respect for the legal process, viewing the mediation as a stage for his personal victory lap. My attorney placed his silver pen on the legal pad. He adjusted his cufflinks and turned his attention to the opposing side of the table. He did not raise his voice. He spoke with the measured, resonant cadence of a seasoned interrogator, preparing to spring a flawless snare. He addressed Preston directly, asking him to verify the financial affidavit submitted to the court earlier that week. My counsel read a specific clause from the document, requiring the affiant to list all global assets, liabilities, debts, and holding companies. He looked Preston in the eye and asked him to confirm under penalty of perjury that the financial disclosure was a complete and honest representation of his current economic standing. Preston chuckled, exchanging a confident glance with Reed. Preston leaned toward the microphone and stated clearly that his disclosures were entirely accurate. He swore he held no hidden offshore accounts, zero unlisted liabilities, and no undisclosed leveraged debts. The red light on the recording device blinked, sealing the lie in the digital archive. Preston had just committed severe federal perjury. He had explicitly denied the offshore gambling debts, the fraudulent bridge loans secured by his father's retirement account, and the unlisted corporate funds he attempted to launder through international cryptocurrency exchanges. He believed his crimes were invisible. He thought his secrets were buried beneath layers of untouchable digital encryption. My attorney did not pause to let the tension settle. He reached into his leather briefcase and extracted a single, crisp manila envelope. He pulled out the 50-page settlement contract Reed had emailed me the previous evening. The document contained the poisoned cross-collateralization clause injected by my legal team. My counsel slid the thick stack of paper across the smooth mahogany wood. The document came to rest directly in front of Preston. My lawyer instructed Preston to examine the final page. He asked him to identify the electronic signature hovering above the notary line. Preston barely glanced at the paper. He leaned back, crossing his arms over his tailored suit. He let out a sharp, arrogant laugh that reverberated through the quiet room. Preston confirmed it was his exact signature. My attorney pressed further, maintaining his sterile tone. He asked if Preston had reviewed the terms of the agreement before authorizing the digital execution. Preston sneered, eager to humiliate me on the official record. He leaned closer to the microphone and stated that he signed the paperwork immediately because he wanted to expedite taking out the trash. He boasted that he authorized the contract without reading it because he knew I possessed zero leverage and would gladly accept the $5,000 pity payment to avoid sleeping on the streets. Kinsley giggled from her corner chair, popping her chewing gum in appreciation of the insult. Reed smiled, leaning back in his chair, satisfied that his client was dominating the negotiation. They were all reveling in a hollow victory. By publicly admitting he executed the contract, Preston had legally bound himself to the hidden indemnification clause. By swearing his financial disclosures were accurate, he had handed a retired federal judge undeniable proof of sworn deceit. The trap was now fully armed and locked. My corporate litigator offered a slow, chilling nod. He stated for the record that the defense was satisfied with the sworn testimony. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The heavy silence replacing the arrogant banter was palpable. Judge Sterling narrowed his piercing gray eyes, sensing the sudden tactical pivot. The retired magistrate reached into his breast pocket and retrieved a pair of silver reading glasses. He placed them deliberately on his face, turning his stern gaze toward my side of the table. Judge Sterling cleared his throat and instructed my attorney to proceed and formally present the defense's financial discovery. My corporate attorney reached down to the floor beside his chair. He grasped the handle of a thick black leather binder and lifted it smoothly, placing it onto the polished mahogany. The dull thud broke the quiet tension hanging in the room. He extended his arm, sliding the heavy portfolio across the smooth wood surface toward Judge Sterling. The retired magistrate retrieved his silver reading glasses from his breast pocket and settled them on the bridge of his nose. He opened the cover. The chamber remained silent. Reed leaned over his client's shoulder, straining his neck to catch a glimpse of the paperwork. Judge Sterling ignored the opposing counsel. He began to read. The judge did not skim the pages. He processed every single line of the certified financial declarations. He reviewed the holding company and corporation filings. He examined the property deeds. Then, he scrutinized the verified account balances. Judge Sterling looked up from the dense documentation. His piercing gray eyes darted toward Preston, then shifted to rest directly on me. He cleared his throat and spoke aloud for the official legal transcript. He stated that the defense had submitted certified banking records, proving my personal net worth exceeded $80 million. The judge read the origin of the funds, detailing the sale of an elite zero-day threat protection software patent to a global tech conglomerate. The magistrate continued reading the real estate portfolio aloud. He confirmed the lakeside cabin was owned by an anonymous corporate entity over which I held sole executive control. Therefore, the plaintiff possessed zero equity in the property he was currently attempting to claim. He had leveraged a phantom asset. Preston had been leaning back in his leather chair. His feet dropped to the floor with a heavy, uncoordinated thud. The arrogant smirk vanished from his face, wiped away by a tidal wave of sheer incomprehension. The blood drained from his cheeks, leaving a sickly, pale hue across his features. He stared at the leather binder, his brain short-circuited, failing to reconcile the data with his fabricated reality. The woman he had berated for wearing faded flannel, the wife he mocked for working a dead-end tech support job, was a multi-millionaire tech founder. The fortune he had desperately tried to extract from his parents and his employer had been sitting across the dinner table for 6 years. He opened his mouth, but his vocal cords refused to function. The psychological dissonance fractured his towering ego into microscopic shards. Reed snatched the binder from the judge, flipping frantically through the glossy pages. The sleazy lawyer turned a stark shade of white, realizing he had just marched his client into a legal slaughterhouse. The undeniable proof of my wealth dismantled their entire narrative of financial negligence and spousal support. The predatory attorney realized he was standing on the wrong side of a vast financial chasm. My litigator did not grant them a single moment to recover their breath. He reached back into his briefcase and produced a second identical black binder. He slid it toward the center of the table. He announced this portfolio contained the finalized financial settlement the plaintiff had just sworn under oath to signing voluntarily. Judge Sterling pulled the second binder forward. He turned to the designated indemnification clause hidden deep within the margin formatting. The retired magistrate read the text aloud, allowing the cold, legal terminology to fill the sterile room. By executing this agreement, Preston assumed sole, non-dischargeable liability for $1.5 million in missing corporate funds tied to his regional healthcare logistics division. Furthermore, he explicitly waived all rights to bankruptcy protection regarding this specific debt. He legally tethered his entire future to the stolen money. Judge Sterling paused, turning the page to examine the attached forensic audit logs, providing undeniable proof of the stolen capital. He read the routing numbers aloud, tracing the diverted healthcare funds directly to the offshore gambling syndicates. He reviewed the forged signature on the bridge loan tied to Edward. The judge lowered his reading glasses, his stern face hardening into a mask of pure, judicial fury. He stated for the record that these documents did not represent a civil asset dispute. They detailed severe federal racketeering, wire fraud, and money laundering. In the far corner of the room, Kinsley stopped chewing her mint gum. Her arrogant posture crumbled into dust. The harsh reality of the situation crashed down upon her shoulders. She looked at Preston, her eyes wide with terror. He was not a wealthy regional director offering her a life of high society luxury. He was a fraud, drowning in over $1 million of toxic, inescapable debt. He had used her as a prop, a convenient distraction while he orchestrated his financial crimes. She remembered the diamond tennis bracelet resting on her wrist. I had ensured the dossier included the corporate credit card receipt tying that exact piece of jewelry to the embezzled funds. Kinsley realized she was wearing stolen evidence. She was inextricably linked to a man who had planned to abandon her the moment the authorities closed in. Her breathing grew shallow, panic replacing her former smug entitlement. The fairy tale she envisioned had morphed into a prison sentence. Preston grabbed the edges of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning white from the strain. He stammered, frantically trying to backpedal away from the precipice. He claimed the signature was a mistake. He insisted the cross-collateralization clause was deceptive. He begged the mediator to strike the document from the record. My attorney calmly reminded him of the glowing red light on the digital audio recorder. The machine had just captured his sworn testimony. He had proudly admitted signing the document without reading it to expedite taking out the trash. The snare was ironclad. He had engineered his own demise, wrapped it in a bow, and handed it to a retired federal judge who despised perjury. The air in the mediation chamber grew thick, suffocating Preston in his self-made trap. Reed shoved his chair backward, standing up abruptly. The predatory lawyer was terrified of impending disbarment for facilitating a fraudulent contract and presenting false financial disclosures. He began stuffing his papers into his briefcase, distancing himself from his client with breathtaking speed. Reed announced he was formally withdrawing as counsel, leaving Preston entirely defenseless. He scrambled toward the corner of the room, desperate to separate himself from the impending fallout. Judge Sterling struck his wooden gavel against the table, demanding order. He announced he was legally obligated to report these findings to the proper authorities immediately. He declared the mediation terminated and ordered all parties to remain seated. I sat perfectly still, watching the empire of lies collapse around my former husband. The meticulous planning had yielded a flawless execution. Every calculation had aligned, rendering him powerless. Then a new sound interrupted the chaotic breathing of the terrified people across the table. Through the heavy oak doors, a rhythmic thudding echoed down the courthouse corridor. Heavy, synchronized footsteps approached our chamber. They moved with strict tactical precision, marching directly toward our closed door. The rhythmic sound grew louder, vibrating through the floorboards and drowning out Preston's frantic pleas. The final phase of my orchestration had arrived. Judge Marcus Sterling did not utter another word to the trembling men seated across his table. The retired magistrate simply lowered his hand beneath the heavy mahogany desk and pressed the silent security perimeter button. The faint, high-pitched hum of the electronic lock disengaging was the only warning. The thick oak doors of the mediation chamber burst inward with staggering force. The polished brass handles slammed against the drywall, fracturing the sterile, quiet atmosphere of the civil dispute. 4 federal agents stepped across the threshold, moving with strict tactical precision. They wore dark, structured windbreakers bearing the stark yellow lettering of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The air in the room shifted instantly, pulling the oxygen from the space as the reality of a federal raid descended upon the occupants. Special Agent Thomas Vance led the formation. He did not rush, nor did he raise his voice. He walked toward the conference table with the measured, inevitable stride of an apex predator cornering wounded prey. Behind him, Special Agent Sarah Jenkins secured the exit, her gaze scanning the room to ensure no one attempted a futile escape. Preston sat frozen in his leather chair. The color had already drained from his face during the revelation of my net worth, but now a sickly, translucent pallor washed over his skin. His eyes darted from the armed agents to the open binders resting on the table. The cognitive dissonance shattered his remaining defenses. The illusion of his elite corporate status evaporated, leaving behind a terrified, hollow shell of a man. Agent Vance halted just 3 feet away from my husband. He withdrew a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt, the metallic clink echoing sharply against the acoustic ceiling tiles. Preston Walsh Vance stated, his baritone voice rumbling with uncompromising authority. You are under arrest for interstate wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and money laundering. The recitation of the charges struck Preston like physical blows. His knees buckled beneath the conference table. The remaining strength bled from his muscles, causing him to slide out of his ergonomic chair. He hit the carpeted floor hard, landing directly on his knees. The custom-tailored suit he had purchased with embezzled healthcare funds wrinkled and pooled around him, a pathetic visual metaphor for his ruined facade. He grabbed the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning white, gasping for air as a full-blown panic attack seized his lungs. "Nathaniel, do something?" Preston wheezed, turning his terrified, tear-streaked face toward his legal counsel. "Fix this. Call a judge. File an injunction." Nathaniel Reed did not reach for his legal pad. The sleazy attorney who had strutted into the room spewing condescending threats and demanding spousal support was now consumed by sheer self-preservation. Reed knew that defending a client who had just committed blatant perjury on an official judicial transcript was a direct path to a disciplinary hearing and disbarment. Furthermore, Reed recognized he had facilitated a settlement contract heavily laced with fraudulent corporate assets. Without exchanging a single glance with his client, Reed snapped the brass locks of his leather briefcase shut. The sharp click sounded like a judge's gavel striking the block. "I am ethically bound to withdraw as your representation effective immediately," Reed announced, his voice tight and breathless. "I have zero involvement in your external financial maneuvers, Mr. Walsh. Do not contact my firm again." Reed snatched his coat from the back of his chair and sprinted toward the open doorway, pressing his body against the doorframe to avoid touching the federal agents as he fled the chamber. Preston watched his high-priced savior abandon him, his mouth hanging open in sheer disbelief. The loyalty among thieves had dissolved the instant the federal shield entered the room. In the far corner, the dynamic of the impending arrests expanded. Agent Jenkins approached the plush guest chair where Kinsley was huddled. The young subordinate tried to press herself backward into the drywall, her designer winter coat rustling loudly. She held her arms tight against her chest, attempting to conceal her wrists. Jenkins did not hesitate. She pointed a firm finger directly at the diamond tennis bracelet, catching the fluorescent light on Kinsley's arm. "Kinsley Adams, stand up," Jenkins commanded. "You are being detained as an accessory to corporate embezzlement and receipt of stolen funds." The reality of the handcuffs closing around her wrists broke Kinsley's arrogant composure into jagged shards. The young woman who had proudly snapped pictures in the diner, mocking my authentic wool sweater and bragging about taking my lakeside cabin, erupted into a hysterical frenzy. The veneer of the wealthy power couple shattered. Kinsley thrashed against the agent's grip, her voice piercing the room in a shrill, desperate shriek. "I had nothing to do with this," Kinsley screamed, tears ruining her meticulous makeup, leaving dark streaks down her flushed cheeks. "He lied to me. Preston told me he earned that money through regional bonuses. I didn't know about the forged deeds or the offshore accounts. He manipulated me." She turned her venomous glare toward the man kneeling on the floor. "Tell them the truth, Preston!" she wailed, her tone dripping with intense self-interest. "Tell them you used me. I want a plea arrangement. I will testify to every single conversation we had about the logistics accounts. I will give you everything you need. Just do not put me in a cell." Preston flinched as Kinsley threw him to the wolves. His grand romance, the relationship he claimed, was built on class and ambition, was nothing but a transactional illusion. The instant the stolen wealth vanished, her devotion turned to lethal hostility. The room devolved into a pathetic symphony of weeping and betrayal. Agent Vance stepped forward, grabbing Preston by the bicep to haul him to his feet. Preston resisted the upward pull. He remained on his knees, shifting his desperate gaze away from the federal agents and directing it toward my side of the table. He looked at me, his face slick with sweat and tears. He realized that the quiet, stoic woman sitting across from him commanded an $80 million empire. His broken mind grasped at that staggering sum, misinterpreting my calculated silence as a potential lifeline. "Joy, please," Preston begged, his voice cracking into a ragged, pathetic whimper. "You have the resources. You can stop this. Post my bail. Hire the best defense attorneys in Boston. We are still married. I was stupid. I was blind. I will leave Kinsley right now. I will sign whatever you want. Just use your capital to fix this." I remained seated. I did not cross my arms, nor did I adjust my posture. I looked down at the man who had laughed in my face and demanded I surrender my home. I analyzed his weeping, wretched form with the same cold, detached precision I used to isolate a malignant line of code during a cybersecurity audit. He was a vulnerability I had successfully patched out of my existence. "My capital," I stated, my voice echoing with glacial, unwavering indifference, "is reserved exclusively for individuals who possess actual integrity." The final sliver of hope extinguished in Preston's eyes. He let out a low, agonizing groan as the realization of his inescapable doom washed over him. He was a fraud. He was deeply in debt, and he was entirely alone. Agent Vance hauled Preston to his feet, forcefully twisting the regional director's arms behind his back. The heavy steel handcuffs locked into place, the unforgiving ratchets securing his wrists. "Let's go," Vance ordered. The agents guided Preston and Kinsley toward the exit. As they crossed the threshold, Preston's legs gave out, forcing the agents to physically drag him down the long corridor. His ragged screams echoed off the polished marble walls, a haunting sound of a towering ego being ground into dust by the relentless machinery of federal justice. I stood up from the mahogany table, smoothing the tailored fabric of my charcoal suit. My corporate litigator packed his briefcase with calm, deliberate efficiency, ensuring the binding legal transcripts and sworn affidavits were securely preserved. We exited the mediation chamber following the chaotic procession down the hallway toward the main atrium. The grand lobby of the municipal courthouse featured soaring ceilings and towering glass windows that framed the frozen New Hampshire landscape. Resting on a curved leather bench near the security checkpoint were Diane and Edward. The in-laws were dressed in their finest country club attire, waiting eagerly to celebrate the successful eviction of their unwanted daughter-in-law. They anticipated seeing Preston stride out of the elevators, holding the settlement paperwork, victorious and wealthy. Instead, the elevator doors chimed and parted to reveal 4 federal agents dragging their weeping, handcuffed son across the terrazzo floor. Diane stood up so quickly she knocked her designer handbag onto the ground, spilling her belongings across the tiles. Her perfectly styled hair seemed to lose its luster as she stared at the unfolding nightmare. Edward clutched his chest, his face turning an unhealthy shade of pale gray. He watched the agents march Preston toward the revolving glass doors. Edward looked past the federal escorts and locked eyes with me. I descended the main staircase, walking with the measured, unbusted stride of an apex predator inspecting the aftermath of a hunt. Edward's mind rapidly processed the scene. The fraudulent bridge loan he had co-signed was frozen. The bank was initiating foreclosure proceedings on his ancestral estate. His golden child was headed to a federal penitentiary for racking up over $1 million in non-dischargeable debt. Diane tried to run forward, screaming her son's name, but a court bailiff stepped into her path, holding up a stern hand to block her interference. She collapsed against her husband, sobbing uncontrollably. They realized, in that singular, devastating moment, that their entire family legacy, their social standing, and their financial security had been incinerated. The quiet, unpretentious IT worker they had ridiculed for 6 years had systematically engineered their total ruin without ever raising her voice. I walked past them, pushing through the heavy glass doors into the biting winter air. The cold wind swept across my face, carrying the promise of a flawless, untethered future. The tactical strike was complete, and the final resolution awaited me at the edge of the frozen lake. 6 months later. The harsh New Hampshire winter yielded to a vibrant, restorative spring. The thick layers of ice covering the lake fractured, melting into pristine, rippling water that reflected the early morning sun. The dense forests of the White Mountains transitioned from a stark, dormant gray into a lush, thriving green canopy. I sat on the expansive cedar deck of my secluded cabin, cradling a ceramic mug of dark roast coffee. The bitter, grounding aroma mingled seamlessly with the crisp scent of pine needles and damp earth. Inside the house, resting on the reclaimed wood dining table, sat a thin stack of legal paperwork. It was my finalized divorce decree, bearing the official embossed seal of the state. The document replaced the forged settlement Preston threw at me half a year prior. The property title remained securely locked within my anonymous corporate holding entity, untainted by the chaos he attempted to unleash. My sanctuary was preserved, the structural integrity of my life reinforced by the trials of the past season. 200 miles south, Preston inhabited a starkly contrasting environment. He resided within the sterile, unforgiving architecture of a federal correctional institution. The bespoke navy suits and silver cufflinks were confiscated during processing, swapped for a standardized, abrasive khaki uniform that offered zero distinction. He occupied a cramped concrete cell measuring 8 feet by 10 feet, a brutal downgrade from the sprawling mountain retreats he once coveted. The daily routine stripped away his carefully manufactured facade, replacing his towering ego with the rigid, monotonous schedule dictated by the prison guards. He woke before dawn, consuming bland, institutional food off a divided plastic tray. He was serving a decade-long sentence for wire fraud, identity theft, and money laundering. He spent his days scrubbing cafeteria floors and enduring the hollow echo of steel doors sliding shut along the cell block. Furthermore, the financial devastation extended far beyond his physical incarceration. The digital trap I set remained unbroken. Upon his eventual release, he would re-enter society burdened by $1.5 million of non-dischargeable debt. The interest would compound relentlessly, ensuring every future paycheck he earned would be immediately garnished to satisfy the federal restitution orders. He sought to elevate his status through deception, yet engineered his own permanent economic ruin. Kinsley escaped a physical cell by turning state's evidence during the preliminary hearings, but her reality offered little comfort. The federal prosecutors leveraged her testimony to solidify Preston's conviction, rewarding her cooperation with a grueling probation mandate rather than a prison term. The designer winter coats and diamond tennis bracelets were seized by the government as illicitly acquired assets. She now wore a stiff, unflattering polyester polo shirt standing behind the checkout counter of a discount retail store located in a bleak, fading strip mall. Her wages hovered near the state minimum, barely covering her basic living expenses. A significant percentage of her weekly earnings was automatically deducted to satisfy the severe civil fines levied against her. To fulfill her 500 hours of mandated community service, she spent her weekends wearing a bright orange reflective vest, picking up discarded trash along the busy, exhaust-filled shoulders of the interstate highway. Her dreams of integrating into elite high society were permanently extinguished. The felony conviction hovering on her permanent record guaranteed she would never again cross the threshold of a corporate boardroom. She gambled her future on a mirage of stolen wealth and lost everything she valued. The collateral damage radiating from Preston's hubris dismantled his parents' curated existence with equal precision. The fraudulent bridge loan Edward co-signed triggered an irrevocable cascade of banking defaults. The financial institutions foreclosed on their sprawling ancestral estate, seizing the property to satisfy the toxic liabilities Preston generated. Diane and Edward were forced to liquidate their antique furniture, their luxury sedans, and their extensive jewelry collections just to secure basic legal representation during the fallout. They relocated to a cramped two-bedroom apartment situated above a noisy commercial laundromat on the outskirts of Concord. The transition shattered Diane's fragile, status-obsessed identity. The country club board swiftly revoked their membership, citing the highly publicized federal scandal and the resulting reputational risk. Her former social circle treated her like a pariah. When Diane walked down the aisles of the local grocery store, the wealthy women she once played tennis with actively averted their gazes, steering their shopping carts in the opposite direction to avoid any association. The quiet whispers and judgmental stares became a daily torment. They cheered for my eviction, enthusiastically packing my belongings into cardboard boxes. Now they lived surrounded by their own unpacked boxes, exiled from the only world they deemed worthy. Amidst the wreckage of the familial syndicate, one individual managed to navigate toward a prosperous horizon. Colin honored the agreement we forged in that dimly lit roadside diner. He provided the flawless internal audit logs necessary to expose the corporate hemorrhaging, acting as the crucial double agent. Recognizing his courage and meticulous attention to detail, I extracted him from the toxic shadow of his brother. Today, Colin thrives as a senior compliance officer at my elite cybersecurity firm. He walks the polished corridors of our Boston headquarters with a newfound quiet confidence. The nervous, anxious demeanor he exhibited while working under Preston vanished, replaced by the sharp focus of a professional, valued for his integrity rather than his blind loyalty. He severed all communication with his parents, refusing to let their bitterness infect his fresh start. He earned his sanctuary through honest, decisive action. I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling the warm liquid trace a path down my throat. The white mountains loomed in the distance, their rugged peaks standing as silent witnesses to the resilience I cultivated. For 6 years, I operated in the background, masking my capabilities to accommodate the fragile insecurities of a man who measured his worth by tearing down others. I allowed him to believe he controlled the narrative. I absorbed the petty insults and the condescending remarks, channeling that friction into the digital architecture of an $80 million enterprise. My wealth remained insulated behind impenetrable layers of encryption, shielded from his predatory reach. My firm is currently expanding, securing international contracts and leading the vanguard of global data protection. I recently acquired the very healthcare logistics company Preston attempted to defraud, restructuring their board and terminating every executive who enabled his reckless behavior. I sit at the helm of an industry titan, unbothered by the noise of mediocre men. The outcome of this ordeal reinforced a fundamental truth about human nature. The most lethal weapon a person can wield is strategic, disciplined silence. True power does not require loud declarations, flashy displays of counterfeit success, or the constant validation of superficial peers. True power thrives in the shadows, analyzing vulnerabilities, building resilient defenses, and waiting for the optimal moment to strike. When you possess authentic leverage, you do not need to argue with those who underestimate you. You do not need to raise your voice to prove your point. You simply step aside and allow their unchecked hubris to guide them into the snare. They will always hand you the tools required for their own destruction. I watched a loon dive beneath the surface of the shimmering lake, hunting for its morning catch. The water rippled, then returned to a state of flawless, glass-like tranquility. I inhaled the fresh spring air, my mind clear and my empire expanding. The ultimate lesson gleaned from this calculated retribution is timeless and unforgiving. You must never interrupt an arrogant individual when they are busy constructing the intricate blueprint of their own spectacular downfall. I often reflect on the profound, echoing quiet that follows a catastrophic collapse. It is not the sudden impact that leaves the deepest impression, but the settling of the dust, revealing the hollow foundations that were destined to crumble from the start. In examining the wreckage of Preston's life and the quiet, unyielding triumph of his wife Joy, we are forced to look beyond a simple tale of marital betrayal. Beneath the forged documents and the seized assets lies a much darker, more pervasive tragedy, a failure of parenting, family responsibility, and moral guidance. The story we just witnessed is not merely about a husband's hubris or a wife's calculated retribution. It is a harsh, unfiltered mirror held up to the modern American family, begging us to question the values we instill in the children we raise. In American culture, we are perpetually seduced by the optics of success. We are taught to chase the corner office, the pristine lakeside retreat, and the bespoke wardrobe that broadcasts our arrival to the world. Parents driven by a natural, but often misguided desire to see their offspring thrive, frequently confuse material elevation with character development. We look at individuals like Preston, a man wrapped in designer fabrics, holding a prestigious title, and society nods in approval, assuming the parents did their job. But when we prioritize the appearance of winning over the integrity of how the game is played, we do not raise strong adults, we cultivate fragile narcissists. We build hollow statues waiting for the first gust of reality to tip them over. Consider the tragic roles of Diane and Edward. Their downfall was not simply a matter of co-signing a fraudulent loan in a desperate bid to save face. Their true crime was committed decades earlier, in the daily, microscopic moments of parenting, where they chose to nurture their son's ego instead of his conscience. When a mother joyfully packs away her daughter-in-law's belongings, celebrating her son's ruthless discard of a human being, she is reaping the toxic harvest of a seed she planted long ago. She taught him that his comfort, his desires, and his status were paramount, superseding fundamental human decency. They shielded him from accountability, assuming their unwavering blind support was an act of profound love. In reality, it was an act of profound sabotage. The traditional family structure is often heralded as the bedrock of society, a sanctuary where values are forged and passed down through generations. Yet, a family is only as strong as its commitment to honesty and fairness. Honesty is not merely the absence of lies. It is the courage to see our children for who they truly are, flaws included, and to hold them to a standard of unyielding integrity. Fairness is teaching them that they are not inherently more deserving than the person standing next to them. If Diane and Edward had spent less time grooming Preston for high society cocktail parties, and more time teaching him the intrinsic value of an authentic, hard-earned dollar, he would never have found himself sitting in a concrete cell. They gave him everything, yet they left him entirely unequipped for the real world. This brings us to the critical necessity of emotional awareness in raising children. Emotional awareness is the ability to recognize the humanity in others, to understand the ripple effects of our actions, and to navigate conflict with empathy rather than cruelty. Joy possessed this awareness. She recognized the toxic dynamic, assessed the familial rot, and shielded herself with calculated precision. Preston, starved of emotional intelligence by parents who only valued superficial victories, viewed people as disposable stepping stones. When we fail to teach our children how to process failure, rejection, and empathy, we leave them vulnerable to their own destructive impulses. We must teach them that true strength does not lie in dominating others or projecting a flawless image, but in the quiet, uncelebrated moments of doing the right thing when no one is watching. Long-term guidance requires parents to make agonizing choices. It requires watching your child struggle and refusing to intervene when the struggle is necessary for their growth. It means allowing them to feel the sting of a poor decision, letting them bear the weight of their own consequences, and resisting the urge to write a check, make a phone call, or forge a path that spares them from discomfort. It is the difficult, exhausting work of raising an adult, not just preserving a child. The New Hampshire spirit of independence and self-reliance that Joy embodied cannot be bought. It must be forged in the fires of accountability. Exploring these complex dynamics of human behavior, family loyalty, and the hidden consequences of our choices is what connects us to our deeper truths. If you find yourself reflecting on the quiet battles fought behind closed doors, the unspoken rules of family, and the profound justice that eventually catches up with us all, I invite you to join our growing community. Follow Samantha Told Stories for more deep, emotional narratives that challenge the way we view the world, our relationships, and ourselves. We delve into the stories that shape our character, offering a safe space to learn, reflect, and grow together. As we look back at the shattered remnants of Preston's life, a chilling realization settles in. We spend our entire lives trying to build safe havens for our families. We lock our doors, invest in our properties, and accumulate wealth to insulate our children from the harsh, unforgiving nature of the outside world. We believe that a parent's ultimate duty is to protect their child from the brutal realities of life. We shield them from the cold, hoping to preserve their innocence and guarantee their success. But perhaps we have had the equation backward all along. The conventional wisdom tells us that we must build a fortress to defend our children from the world. Yet when we raise a child without honesty, without fairness, and without the heavy grounding anchor of emotional awareness, The fortress becomes a prison of their own making. The ultimate uncomfortable truth of parenting is not that it is our job to protect our children from the world. It is our profound, agonizing duty to protect the world from our children by ensuring we do not unleash entitled, hollow individuals into a society that will inevitably ruthlessly tear them down. We must let them taste defeat in the safety of our homes, so they do not choke on it in the unforgiving court of reality. When the dust finally settles and you look at the life you have built, ask yourself, have you raised a person capable of surviving the storm? Or have you simply raised the storm itself,